He was the quietest man in the room and the most dangerous one they'd ever dismissed. A billionaire's son just grabbed a young woman's wrist in front of 200 executives, and every single one of them looked away. Every security guard stiffened but stayed still. Every lawyer in the room suddenly found something fascinating to study in their champagne glass. Every person except one. A man in a $30 shirt. A single father nobody knew. A ghost the military had buried in classified files for 15 years. What happens next will change everything. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like, stay until the end. This one's worth it. The Hartwell Grand's 42nd floor wasn't built for people like Ethan Brooks. That much was obvious the moment he stepped off the elevator and caught his own reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirrors lining the entrance corridor. Navy sport coat, collar open, no tie. Dress shoes that had been polished but were still clearly the kind you bought on sale at a department store rather than ordered from a shop that required an appointment. He'd ironed his shirt himself that morning, which meant there was a faint diagonal crease running across his left shoulder that he'd noticed too late to fix. He'd stood in front of his bathroom mirror for 11 minutes before leaving the apartment, which was 9 minutes longer than he normally spent on his appearance. This was his daughter's night. He wanted to look like he belonged in the same room as her. He wasn't sure he'd succeeded. The reception was already in full swing when he found his way through the glass doors and into the main hall. The room was vast, deliberately, architecturally vast, the kind of space designed to make human beings feel appropriately small inside it. Crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling that had to be 30 feet above the polished marble floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows on the eastern wall gave a panoramic view of the city at night, the grid of lights stretching out to the horizon like something expensive and indifferent. Waitstaff moved through the crowd with the practiced invisibility of people who had learned to become furniture, balancing trays of champagne flutes and small plates of food that cost more per bite than Ethan typically spent on a week's worth of groceries. There were maybe 200 people in the room. Ethan clocked them the way he always clocked rooms, not anxiously, just out of habit that had long since fused itself to his nervous system. Exits. 4 visible, 2 likely service doors behind the bar, 1 emergency stairwell partially obscured by a folding display of the company's latest quarterly projections. Potential problem areas. The cluster of men near the far corner who'd been drinking long enough that their laughter had started to carry. The narrow bottleneck near the catering station where foot traffic was backing up. The elevated platform near the windows where a small podium stood, waiting for whatever formal remarks would eventually be made. He filed it all away in under 3 seconds. Then he stopped doing it, because this wasn't that kind of night. Stop, he told himself. You're at a party. Your kid invited you. Have a drink and try to act like a normal person. He plucked a glass of water from a passing tray. The waiter didn't even blink at the substitution, and moved further into the room looking for Maya. But Maya Brooks was 23 years old and had inherited exactly none of her father's preference for blending into the background. He spotted her from across the room, which was not difficult because she was laughing at something, that full-body laugh she'd had since she was 4 years old, the one that started in her chest and ended with her head tilting back slightly, like whatever was funny had physically moved through her. She was standing with a small group near one of the window alcoves, 3 other young professionals roughly her age, all of them clearly interns or junior associates from the comfortable but not quite comfortable way they held their drinks, and positioned themselves slightly outside the natural orbit of the senior executives nearby. Maya had her mother's cheekbones. She had Ethan's eyes. The combination was striking in a way that neither parent had ever quite gotten used to. She saw him about 30 seconds after he saw her, and something happened to her face that made something in Ethan's chest tighten in a way he didn't have a word for. Just a brief flash of pure, uncomplicated happiness, like a kid who had been waiting for someone to show up and was genuinely relieved they had. Dad? She was weaving through the crowd toward him, and when she reached him, she hugged him with both arms, which she hadn't done in public in years. You came. You invited me. I know, but I thought you might bail. You always hate these things. I've never been to one of these things. You hate the idea of these things. She pulled back and looked at him critically, the way she'd been doing since she was about 12 and had decided she had opinions about his wardrobe. Your shirt has a crease. I know. Did you iron it yourself? Yes? Dad? I'm aware. She smoothed the crease with 2 fingers, which didn't help but which she seemed to feel was necessary, then looped her arm through his and started steering him toward the window alcoves. Come on, I want you to meet some people, and I want you to eat something because you look like you haven't eaten since Tuesday. I ate this morning. What did you eat? A pause. Coffee. That's not food. It has beans in it. She made a sound that was half laugh, half genuine exasperation. And for a moment she was 8 years old again, and he was trying to convince her that cereal counted as a complete dinner, and she was looking at him with that expression that said she understood, on some fundamental level, that the adult in this situation was not the adult. Some things didn't change. Her name was Maya Brooks, and she was an intern at Sinclair Industries. Not a senior position, not a prestigious one, but she'd earned it by submitting an unsolicited market analysis to the company's public email address 7 months ago. An analysis so thorough and so unexpectedly insightful that it had made it all the way up to Victoria Sinclair's desk before anyone thought to check who had sent it. The story had become something of a legend in the intern cohort. Maya didn't tell it herself. She'd had to hear it secondhand from a senior associate who'd witnessed the moment Victoria Sinclair read the email, looked up, and asked, "Who is this?" When someone explained it was an unsolicited submission from an undergraduate applying for an internship, Victoria had reportedly been quiet for a moment. Then she'd said, "Hire her." Maya had been here for 4 months. She worked harder than anyone else in her cohort and asked better questions and made fewer mistakes. And she was visibly, almost painfully eager to prove that the opportunity hadn't been wasted on her. Ethan had watched all of this with the quiet attention of a man who had learned, over the course of 23 years, that his job was not to solve his daughter's problems, but to be present enough that she felt safe having them. He'd driven her to her first day. He'd listened to 4 months of debrief calls on his drive home from the training center where he now worked. He'd learned more about corporate governance and shareholder voting structures than he'd ever particularly wanted to know. He was proud of her in a way that didn't have clean edges. It was the kind of pride that hurt a little, because it also meant watching her become someone who was moving further and further into a world he didn't belong to. Tonight was the exception. Tonight, she'd asked him to be here. So here he was. The 3 interns in Maya's group were named Derek, Priya, and a young man named Callum, who immediately shook Ethan's hand too hard in the way that young men sometimes did when they were nervous and trying not to show it. "Maya talks about you a lot," Priya said. She seemed genuinely warm, the kind of person who had real opinions and wasn't afraid to share them. "She said you run a training center?" "Yeah, combat fitness mostly, some self-defense work. I do consulting sometimes for private security firms, but that's occasional." "That's cool. What's your background? Military?" "Some time ago," Ethan said. He didn't elaborate. He rarely did. It wasn't secrecy exactly. It was more that the explanation was longer than most people wanted to sit through, and it usually prompted questions he found tedious to answer. Yes, it was dangerous. Yes, he'd seen things. No, he didn't want to talk about the things. Yes, he was fine. He was fine. Callum, who had been listening with the particular attentiveness of someone trying to figure out where to place a person in their internal hierarchy, said, "What branch?" "Navy." "Cool. Like ships and stuff?" A short pause. "Something like that." Maya was looking at a fixed point slightly above Callum's left shoulder in a way that suggested she was exercising considerable restraint. Ethan caught her eye and gave a microscopic shake of his head. "Leave it." She looked away. The corner of her mouth twitched. He was fine. This was fine. The room shifted around 8 o'clock. It was subtle, the kind of change you wouldn't notice if you weren't paying attention, but the air pressure in large rooms changed when certain people entered them, and Ethan noticed. Near the main entrance, the crowd rearranged itself slightly, conversations pausing and then resuming with a different energy. Heads turned. Someone laughed too loudly in a way that sounded like performance. Tristan Caldwell had arrived. Ethan didn't know the name yet. He just watched the man move through the room with the specific kind of ease that came from a lifetime of having rooms rearrange themselves around you. Late 20s, maybe 30, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in the kind of suit that didn't look expensive because it transcended the category entirely. It just looked like what clothing was supposed to be. His hair was the studied, careless of someone who'd spent 45 minutes achieving the appearance of spending no time at all. He moved through the room, greeting people with the proprietary confidence of someone who believed, on a foundational level, that every room he entered was already his. Two men followed him at the slight distance that indicated assistance or security, close enough to be useful, far enough back not to crowd him. Ethan clocked the whole thing in about 4 seconds, then went back to his conversation. The projections for Q4 are interesting, Priya was saying, but the real story is in the supply chain restructuring. The margins… Priya, Derek was staring past her shoulder. Tristan Caldwell just walked in. The three interns did the involuntary thing that people did when they'd heard someone's name many times in a professional context and then unexpectedly encountered the physical person. A kind of recalibration. Maya was slightly more restrained about it than the other two, but not entirely. His family owns about 12% of the company, Maya said to Ethan, because he was the only person in the conversation who looked genuinely unimpressed. The Caldwells. They've been trying to increase their board influence for 2 years. There's a vote tonight at midnight. That's really why everyone's here. The reception is the reception, but the vote is what actually matters. What are they voting on? Board restructuring. If it passes, the Caldwells get 2 additional seats. If it fails… She tilted her head slightly. They've been very quiet about what happens if it fails. That's never a good sign. No, she agreed. It isn't. Ethan found a relatively uncrowded section near the windows and spent a while watching the room do what rooms like this did. The elaborate social choreography of people who had enormous amounts of money and power and were also, underneath all of it, still just people trying to figure out whether the people around them respected them. He'd been in rooms like this before, though they hadn't looked like this. Different rooms, different costumes, different stakes. The fundamental performance of status was the same everywhere he'd ever been. People sized each other up. People established hierarchies. People decided within the first 30 seconds of any interaction where the other person ranked and adjusted their behavior accordingly. The only difference between a corporate reception on the 42nd floor of the Hartwell Grand and a lot of other places Ethan had spent time was that in those other places, the consequences of getting the hierarchy wrong were different in kind. Here, if you misread the room, you lost a deal. Other places, other calculus. He'd chosen this. He'd walked away from the other calculus 12 years ago, and he didn't regret it, and he didn't miss it, and he was standing at a party on the 42nd floor watching his daughter network in a room full of powerful people, and that was good. That was the whole point. That was what 12 years of single parenthood and training center consulting fees and driving her to school and sitting through parent-teacher conferences and making cereal for dinner when he hadn't had time to cook something real. That was what all of it had been for. He was on his second glass of water when someone nearby said, in a voice pitched for carrying, "Who let the janitor in?" He didn't turn around. Not because he hadn't heard it. He'd heard it clearly. But because turning around would have been giving the comment more weight than it deserved. And he was 38 years old and had spent a significant portion of his adult life in situations where the ability to not react to provocation was literally a survival skill. The comment had come from a group of 3 men roughly 10 feet to his left, senior executives by the look of them, expensive suits, the comfortable contempt of people who had never had to wonder whether they belonged in a room. They were looking at him with the specific expression of people who were enjoying a private joke at someone else's expense and weren't particularly concerned about being overheard. "I'm serious," one of them said, slightly lower but still audible. "Did someone's driver get confused and come inside?" A short laugh from the group. Ethan took a sip of water, watched the city lights through the window. The third man in the group, shorter, sharp-faced, with the eyes of someone who spent a lot of time calculating, glanced over at Ethan and then looked away, the specific look of dismissal that said, "Not a factor, not worth the attention." Ethan had received that look in various forms across most of his life, from teachers who'd decided early that he wasn't interesting, from people at every level of the military command structure who'd looked at him and seen ordinary before they'd learned enough to see what was actually there, from ex-wife's family when she'd first brought him home, before Maya, back when he'd been a 22-year-old kid in his first dress uniform that didn't quite fit right. The look didn't bother him the way it used to. It was just information. He moved away from the window, found a spot near one of the high cocktail tables, and waited for Maya to reappear. Victoria Sinclair arrived at 8:47 p.m., which was later than she'd intended and earlier than she'd feared. She moved through the reception with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to treat every public appearance as a managed operation with objectives, risks, and measurable outcomes. Shake these hands, acknowledge these faces, avoid that conversation, have this one, spend no more than 4 minutes in any single exchange. She'd done the mental math before leaving her office. 200 people in the room, roughly half of whom required at least a brief acknowledgement, 90 minutes before she needed to be in the conference room, reviewing final vote projections. She was very good at the math. What she was less good at, what she had always been less good at, though she would have argued the point fiercely with anyone who raised it, was the thing underneath the math. The room that existed when the math stopped. The version of herself that didn't have objectives. She pushed that thought aside with the practiced efficiency she pushed everything aside with. And she worked the room. Victoria Sinclair was 30 years old and had been CEO of Sinclair Industries for 14 months, which was the kind of information that people led with when introducing her because it was genuinely remarkable and also because it let them feel, briefly, that they were in the presence of something extraordinary while still believing, privately, that something extraordinary probably had cracks in it somewhere if you looked hard enough. She had inherited the position under conditions she didn't discuss publicly and didn't think about more than necessary. Her father's health, the speed of the transition, the board's initial resistance, the 6 months of proving herself so relentlessly that she'd lost 11 pounds from stress and forgotten what it felt like to sleep until her alarm went off. All of that was behind her. Mostly. The vote tonight was the test of whether it actually was. She was 30 minutes into her circuit of the room when she saw Ethan Brooks. She stopped, briefly. A hiccup in her managed efficiency that she recovered from quickly enough that probably no one noticed, but she noticed. He looked the same. That was always the first thought every time she'd encountered him over the years. At Maya's school events, at holiday gatherings when they'd briefly tried to make co-parenting look normal, and the occasional unavoidable proximity that came with sharing a child across 17 years of not being together. He looked exactly like himself. He didn't age in the conventional way. He just became more settled into what he already was, like wood that had dried and hardened into its final grain. He was standing alone near a cocktail table, a glass of water in his hand, watching the room with the unhurried attention of a man who was not anxious, not bored, not performing anything at all, just present. She had forgotten somehow that Maya had mentioned inviting him, or she'd remembered and filed it under manageable and then stopped thinking about it. Either way, seeing him standing here in this room on this specific night produced a complicated sensation somewhere below her breastbone that she identified and then firmly declined to examine. She had a vote to win. She did not have time for complicated sensations. She redirected her circuit and did not approach him. The night proceeded. Speeches were made, brief, carefully calibrated speeches about growth and vision and the company's commitment to its stakeholders, the kind of language that carried almost no information while sounding like it contained a great deal. The company's general counsel, a silver-haired man named Richard Marsh, who had the careful eyes of someone who'd been watching corporate politics for 30 years, moved through the room with the specific attentiveness of a man taking inventory. Board members clustered in conversational groups that shifted and reformed with the slow inevitability of weather systems. Tristan Caldwell worked the room with impressive efficiency. He was good at it. That had to be acknowledged. He had genuine charm when he deployed it, the kind that made people feel briefly that they were the most interesting person he'd talked to all evening. He could do warmth. He could do intensity. He could do self-deprecating humor with the slight awkwardness that made it seem real rather than performed. What he couldn't quite do, and Ethan noticed this from across the room because it was the kind of thing he'd been trained to notice, was turn it off completely. There was something underneath the charm that stayed consistent across every interaction, a particular set to his jaw, a quality to his attention, something that said, I am managing this person in a way that occasionally became visible at the edges. Ethan watched him with the mild, non-judgmental attention he gave to most things. He wasn't a threat. He was a young man with a lot of inherited advantage and a narrowly calibrated view of the world. Not Ethan's problem. Then Tristan Caldwell crossed the room toward the cluster near the window where Maya and the other interns were standing. Ethan's attention sharpened, not dramatically. From the outside, he probably looked exactly the same. A man with a glass of water, watching the room. But something inside him made the subtle recalibration that it always made when his daughter entered a situation he didn't have complete information about. He watched. Acham. The approach started friendly enough. Tristan had the easy confidence of a man who expected to be welcomed wherever he went, and the interns responded to him the way most people in subordinate professional positions responded to the arrival of someone significantly more powerful. A kind of bright, slightly rigid attentiveness, like plants orienting toward a light source. Maya was visibly less dazzled than the others, which Ethan noticed with a small private pride. She smiled when introduced, she was polite, she asked a question or two. But she didn't perform, and she didn't shrink, and she held her ground in the conversation with the same straightforward confidence she'd had since she was a teenager arguing about something at the dinner table. He was too far away to hear what was being said. He watched the body language. Tristan's attention had fixed on Maya in a way that was not overtly wrong. Not yet. Just concentrated. The specific concentration of a man who'd found something interesting and was deciding what to do about it. Maya said something. Tristan laughed. His two associates had drifted slightly to the periphery, giving him space. Then the conversation shifted. Something changed in Tristan's posture. A slight forward lean, an increase in the directional intensity of his attention. He said something and Maya's expression flickered. Not fear, just the brief recalibration of someone who'd heard something they weren't expecting. She stepped back half a step. He stepped forward. She said something. A short sentence, firm. Ethan could read the shape of it. Polite, but clear. The universal language of a person trying to exit a conversation with their dignity intact. Tristan Caldwell's hand came out and closed around her wrist. The room did not go silent all at once. It went silent in concentric circles, the way a stone drops into water. The people closest first, then the people who noticed the people closest going quiet, then the people who noticed them, spreading outward until the ambient noise of 200 executives dropped to almost nothing in the space of maybe 4 seconds. Maya's face went still, the specific stillness of a young woman who has just been reminded in a very public place that she is not as safe as she thought she was. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something older and colder and more tired than fear. The recognition of a pattern she'd probably encountered before, in smaller ways that had now escalated into something that had a witness count. The people nearest to them had all made the same calculation simultaneously. Ethan watched it happen. Watched every senior executive and board member and legal counsel and vice president in the immediate vicinity discover something fascinating to look at that was not Maya's face or Tristan Caldwell's hand around her wrist. Security staff stiffened, stayed put. A woman near the bar said something quietly to the man beside her, and neither of them moved. The room held its breath and waited for someone else to decide what to do. Ethan had already put down his water glass. He moved through the room without rushing, which was itself a kind of statement. He didn't push past people or raise his voice or announce his approach. He just moved. And people got out of his way without quite understanding why. The way people sometimes moved out of the way of things without being able to explain the instinct afterward. He stopped about 4 feet from Tristan Caldwell. Let go of her wrist. His voice was completely level. Not loud, not aggressive. The specific register of a man who wasn't asking. The room somehow got quieter. Tristan Caldwell turned his head and saw, for the first time, the man who had spoken. He did the thing. The automatic assessment. The same calculus everyone did. And what he saw was mid-30s, average build, department store sport coat, no obvious markers of money or status. A nobody. A man who had wandered into the wrong conversation. His expression didn't quite achieve contempt, but it got partway there. I'm sorry. And you are? Her father. Let go. Something moved across Tristan's face, the ghost of a recalibration, and then the decision to override it. His hand stayed where it was, his jaw set. This is a private conversation, he said, the deliberate patience of a man who considered himself the most reasonable person in any room he was in. I'd suggest you... I'm not going to suggest anything, Ethan said. I'm telling you to let go of my daughter's wrist. This is the only time I'm going to say it. The room was completely silent. 200 people watched a young man decide whether to listen. Tristan Caldwell made his decision. His grip tightened. What happened next was fast. Not violent, not dramatic in the way that violence in films is dramatic, with impact and sound and consequence spread out for the audience. It was fast the way things were fast when someone very good at something did that thing without effort or announcement. 1 second, Tristan Caldwell was holding Maya Brooks' wrist and deciding that the quiet man in the sport coat was not a serious problem. The next second, his arm was at an angle that produced an involuntary step forward to release the pressure. Maya's wrist was free. She stepped back. Tristan's 2 associates moved and then stopped moving because by the time they'd reacted, there was nothing to react to. The whole thing was already finished, and the man in the sport coat was already stepping back, already creating distance, already demonstrating without any particular emphasis that the situation was over. Tristan Caldwell's face had gone a specific shade of red that had nothing to do with physical pain and everything to do with something considerably worse. He'd been handled, in front of 200 people, by a man in a $30 shirt. The silence held for 3 full seconds. Then, as if someone had hit a switch, everyone started talking at once. Maya found her voice before anyone else did. "Dad?" Her voice was low, controlled, but her hands were shaking slightly. He could see it from where he stood, 4 feet away, watching the room reconstruct itself around what had just happened. "I'm okay. I know." He kept his voice quiet. "Are you hurt?" No, I'm fine." She looked at her wrist. There'd be a mark, probably nothing more than that, but the gesture told him everything he needed to know about how she felt, regardless of what she said. "I'm fine." Tristan Caldwell was standing 6 feet away, rolling his shoulder in the practiced way of someone trying to walk off a minor defeat, and his 2 associates were flanking him now, the energy of the group shifting towards something that Ethan recognized as the precursor to escalation. "You just assaulted me," Tristan said. His voice was controlled, but the color was still wrong in his face. "In front of 200 witnesses." "I moved your arm," Ethan said. "Your daughter is standing right here." "I moved your arm," Ethan said. "You were holding someone against their will." "That's not what happened." Tristan looked around the room, not nervously, but assessingly, like a man who is already calculating the narrative. "That is absolutely not what happened, and I think, enough." A new voice cut through the noise. Victoria Sinclair had materialized at the edge of the cleared space, and the room's attention swung toward her with the immediate gravitational pull of someone accustomed to being the center of things. She was looking at the scene in front of her with an expression that Ethan recognized, the carefully assembled neutrality of a person doing rapid political calculation. She looked at Tristan. She looked at Maya. She looked finally at Ethan. Something moved across her face, something she put away quickly. "I think," she said, "that we should take this conversation somewhere private." It was not an offer. It was the specific cadence of someone exercising authority. Tristan smoothed his jacket. "I agree completely." The color in his face was normalizing, and his expression had settled into something almost pleasant. "I think there are some things that need to be clarified." He walked toward the conference room off the main hall. His associates followed. Victoria Sinclair did not look at Ethan again. She turned and followed. Around the room, conversation slowly resumed. Waitstaff reappeared with trays. The enormous machine of the reception recalibrated, moved on. Maya was standing 3 feet from Ethan, and she was not okay. In the way that people are sometimes not okay, while also being technically fine. "Hey!" He moved toward her. "Hey, look at me!" She looked at him. Her eyes were bright in a way that wasn't tears yet, but was in the neighborhood. "You okay?" A pause. A small exhale. "I hate that he grabbed me like that," she said quietly. Like I was just something he could put his hand on." "I know. And I hate that the whole room just..." She stopped. Nobody was going to do anything. He didn't tell her that wasn't true, because it was true. And she'd been in the room and seen it, and she was 23 years old and didn't need him to manage the reality of what she'd just witnessed. "I know," he said again. She looked at him for a moment, then, "You moved really fast." "Yeah. I didn't even... One second he had my wrist, and then he didn't." "Are you sure you're not hurt?" She looked at her wrist again, flexed her fingers. "I'm fine." "Dad, go. They're going to..." She gestured toward the conference room. "Victoria's in there. They're going to say whatever they're going to say, and nobody's going to be in there who..." She stopped, and the sentence finished itself in the space between them. "Nobody's going to be in there who's on your side." He looked at her for a moment. Then he turned and walked toward the conference room. The conference room off the main hall was smaller than the main space, but still designed to impress. A long, oval table of dark wood, chairs that cost more than some people's cars, a wall of glass overlooking the city. By the time Ethan pushed open the door, there were 7 people already inside. Tristan Caldwell had positioned himself at the head of the table, which said something. His 2 associates stood behind him. Victoria Sinclair stood at the side of the table, not quite seated, which said something else. 2 men Ethan didn't recognize were near the window, one with the careful posture of legal counsel, the other with the compact alertness of security. And at the far end of the table, Richard Marsh, the company's general counsel, was seated with a legal pad in front of him that was already open to a fresh page. They all looked at Ethan when he walked in. The man near the window, the compact one, said, "Sir, this room is..." "He has every right to be here," Victoria said quietly, cutting off the sentence. There was something careful in her voice. Not warmth, not coldness either. Something in between that Ethan recognized as a person trying very hard to hold a position they hadn't decided on yet. Tristan looked at Ethan with the specific expression of a man who had reorganized a room to his advantage in the interval and was enjoying the sensation. "Please, sit down." An elegant gesture toward a chair that was deliberately positioned across the table from him, lower, slightly, than the chairs around the head. Ethan did not sit down. He stood near the door with his hands relaxed at his sides and waited. Tristan processed this, adjusted. "Look," he said, and the charm came back on like a light switch, the specifically calibrated warmth that was designed to make you doubt your own perception of everything that had happened before it. "I understand things got tense out there. These events, there's a lot of pressure, a lot of important conversations happening simultaneously. Sometimes things get misread." "Your hand was on my daughter's wrist," Ethan said. "Nothing about that was misread. She misinterpreted a gesture. I watched it happen from 40 feet away. I watched her step back and you step forward, and then your hand come out. I watched her face when it happened." A pause. There was nothing to misinterpret. The charm flickered. "What you did," Tristan said, and the pleasant voice was still there, but something underneath it had sharpened. "Constitutes assault. My lawyers are going to take the position..." "Your lawyers can take whatever position they want," Ethan said evenly. "That's what they're paid to do." "Mr. Brooks," Richard Marsh spoke for the first time. His voice was the measured voice of a man who had spent decades learning to be the calmest person in any given room. "My name is Richard Marsh. I'm general counsel for Sinclair Industries. Would you like to walk us through what you observed, from your perspective?" Ethan looked at him for a moment, making the assessment. The man had careful eyes and a straight spine, and he was writing something on his legal pad while also looking up, the specific coordination of someone who listened and recorded simultaneously and was very good at both. "Tristan Caldwell grabbed my daughter's wrist when she attempted to step back from a conversation she was trying to leave," Ethan said. "I asked him to let go twice. He didn't. I removed his hand. And the manner in which I used a basic control technique, minimum force necessary. Nothing was damaged." A brief silence. Tristan's jaw worked. "That's... You have no idea who you're dealing with." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Ethan said, and his voice was still completely level, and that, more than anything else in the conversation, seemed to land somewhere uncomfortable. "Your family owns 12% of this company," Victoria said suddenly. Everyone looked at her. She was looking at Tristan with the expression of a woman doing math. "And tonight there is a board vote, and this incident," she paused on the word, "happened in front of 200 of our most important shareholders, board members, and media contacts." Another pause. Walk me through your understanding of how the next 12 hours are going to unfold. Tristan looked at her for a long moment. Carefully, he said. Good, Victoria said. Then we agree. Ethan left the conference room at 9:43 p.m. The conversation had continued another 45 minutes after that initial exchange, cycling through legal language and corporate positioning and the specific choreography of powerful people trying to find a shape for something that had no clean shape. Tristan Caldwell had stopped speaking to Ethan directly after the first 10 minutes, which was a choice that communicated things about the shape of his discomfort more clearly than words would have. Richard Marsh had asked Ethan 3 careful questions and written down the answers with the attentiveness of a man storing information he intended to use. Victoria Sinclair had spoken 6 sentences directly to Ethan across the entire meeting, all of them measured, none of them what anyone in the room was actually thinking. When it was over, or when it arrived at the temporary pause that would have to serve as over, for now, Ethan walked back into the main reception hall, found the spot near the window where he'd left his water glass, and discovered that someone had cleared it. Maya appeared beside him 8 minutes later. Her composure was back in place, the professional composure she'd been building for 4 months, but it was sitting on top of something that wasn't quite settled. How was it? She asked. Complicated, Ethan said. Is that? She stopped, started again. Are you okay? Like, legally, are you? I don't know yet. He was honest with her, the way he'd always been honest with her, even when she was small and the truth wasn't comfortable. Depends on a few things. She was quiet for a moment. Dad, I'm sorry that you got pulled into this. He looked at her. You didn't pull me into anything. I invited you here. That's not the same thing. She didn't look entirely convinced. Maya, he waited until she looked at him. I would do exactly what I did regardless of where it happened and what the consequences are. You understand that? A pause. Something moved in her face. Yeah, she said. I know. They stood at the window together for a while, looking at the city. The reception continued around them, conversation and champagne and the enormous, expensive performance of a world that had moved on from what had happened and was now busy arranging itself for the midnight vote. Somewhere in the building, Richard Marsh was writing things down. Somewhere on the 42nd floor, Tristan Caldwell was making phone calls. Somewhere in her office, Victoria Sinclair was staring at something that wasn't the document in front of her. And Ethan Brooks stood at the window with his daughter and didn't say anything, because sometimes there wasn't anything to say, and he'd learned a long time ago that the most important thing he could offer the people he loved was simply to stay in the room. He was good at staying in rooms. It was, in the end, what he'd always been best at. The midnight vote was 3 hours away. Outside, the city went on doing what cities do, indifferent, enormous, lit up against the dark in that way that always looked, from 40 stories up, less like civilization and more like something trying very hard to hold back the night. Inside the Hartwell Grand, the quiet war that had started the moment a young man put his hand on someone he shouldn't have was just beginning to find its shape. And in a classified file in a federal database that most people at this party didn't know existed, the name Ethan Brooks appeared next to a set of designations that the man himself never mentioned. He'd never needed to. The night had 37 people in it who thought they understood the room. Not one of them had understood it yet. Richard Marsh left the conference room at 9:51 p.m. with 8 pages of notes and a headache that had started behind his left eye and was working its way forward. He'd been general counsel for Sinclair Industries for 11 years. Before that, corporate litigation for a firm in Boston that handled the kind of cases that didn't get written about in the news. Before that, law school, where he'd graduated 3rd in his class and spent a long time believing that the law was primarily about truth and only secondarily about everything else. 31 years of practice had adjusted that belief considerably, though he still held on to a version of it the way you held on to a version of most things you'd believed when you were young, with less certainty, more affection. He'd seen a lot of conference rooms, a lot of tense conversations, a lot of people performing control while actually losing it. What he hadn't seen very often was a man with no institutional power, no legal representation, no social capital in the room whatsoever, sit in a conference room with a Caldwell and make the Caldwell look small without raising his voice or saying anything that wasn't simply unadorned, true. He stood in the corridor outside the conference room and looked at his notes. The third page had 3 words circled: Ethan Brooks, Navy. He'd asked the question as a formality, the kind of background question you asked everyone when you were building a picture of an incident. Any prior military service? And Brooks had said, with the specific flatness of someone giving information they considered unremarkable, Navy? 8 years. Something about the way the man moved. Something about the economy of the technique he'd used on Caldwell. Not aggressive, not showy, the absolute minimum necessary to accomplish the objective, and not 1 degree beyond that. Marsh had been watching, and he'd watched a lot of altercations in his time, and what he'd seen was not the impulsive reaction of a working-class father who'd lost his temper. What he'd seen was training, old, deep training, the kind that didn't announce itself. He took out his phone and called his assistant, who was still in the office because Marsh had told her to be. "I need everything you can find on an Ethan Brooks," he said. "Approximately 38 years old. Former Navy. I need it in 90 minutes. A pause. "How thorough?" "As thorough as the timeline allows. Focus on military records. Anything public first, then see if any of our defense contacts can open a door." He hung up and stood in the corridor for a moment, listening to the faint noise of the reception still going on in the main hall. Something about tonight felt like it had more layers than it was showing. That was a feeling he'd learned over 31 years to pay attention to. He walked toward the elevator bank and took out his phone again. There was work to do. Maya found Derek and Priya still in the window alcove where she'd left them. Callum had disappeared. She'd find out later he'd identified someone more senior to attach himself to, which was very Callum. And the 2 remaining interns looked at her with the carefully neutral expressions of people who had witnessed something and were waiting to be told how to process it. "Are you okay?" Priya asked immediately. "Yes." The word came out clean. Maya had made a decision somewhere between the conference room and here, not a conscious decision exactly, more like the body making a choice before the mind caught up. She was not going to fall apart tonight. Not here, not in this room, not in front of people whose professional opinion of her was still being formed. "I'm fine." "What happened in the conference room?" "Conversation, lawyers, the usual." She glanced around the room. The reception was still going with the specific tenacity of events that had momentum and money behind them and weren't going to stop simply because something uncomfortable had happened at its edges. "Is Victoria back out?" Derek nodded toward the far side of the room. "She came out about 5 minutes ago. She's been talking to Hargrove and some of the board members near the bar." Maya followed his gaze. Victoria Sinclair was standing with 3 men whose names Maya had memorized from board documents. Senior board members, all of them, the ones who were undecided on tonight's vote. Victoria was talking with the focused attention she brought to everything, and her expression was the careful one, the one that didn't give anything away. She looked up, briefly, found Maya's eyes across the room. Maya held her gaze. After a moment, Victoria looked away and continued her conversation. Maya turned back to the window. Her wrist was fine. She'd checked it twice in the corridor, and there was a light mark, already fading. Nothing that would leave anything. Physically, she was fine. That was true. The thing that wasn't fine was harder to name, the specific feeling of having been grabbed in public and having had everyone around her calculate whether it was worth reacting to, and then collectively decide it wasn't. She'd known, intellectually, that rooms like this operated on logic that wasn't about right and wrong. She'd read the theory. She'd heard the stories. But there was a difference between knowing a thing and standing in the room while it happened to you, while your wrist was being held and you were looking at 20 people who were all looking somewhere else. The difference was enormous. "He moved really fast," Derek said quietly, after a moment. "Your dad. I've never seen anything like that." "Yeah." "Where did he learn?" "Navy," Maya said. Simple. The same way her father had always said it when people asked. Like it was complete, which it wasn't, but which was all she was going to offer right now. Derek nodded and said nothing else. He was smarter than he sometimes appeared. Ethan found a chair near the window at 10:15 p.m., which was the first time he'd sat down since arriving at the Hartwell Grand, and he sat in it and looked at nothing in particular for a while. His right hand was completely steady. That wasn't something he thought about anymore. It had been steady through things that made tonight look very uncomplicated, but he noticed it the way he sometimes noticed his own composure, with a small remove, like observing a fact about someone else. He was thinking about the look on Victoria's face in the conference room, the 6 measured sentences, the specific neutrality that he recognized because he'd been watching her face across various distances for most of their adult lives, and he knew what it looked like when she was managing information rather than responding to it. He understood why she'd handled it the way she had. He didn't like it, but he understood it. She had a vote in 2 hours, and a company that was in the middle of a power play, and a man from one of her largest shareholder families sitting across a conference room table. She couldn't afford to take a side. She couldn't afford to be seen taking a side. What he minded, if he was being honest with himself, and he generally tried to be, in the private spaces where no one was watching, was that she'd looked at their daughter for about 3 seconds in that room. 3 seconds. Maya had been standing there with the mark on her wrist still visible, and the composure that her mother had probably not noticed was costing her something to maintain. And Victoria had given her 3 seconds and then directed her attention back to the political calculus of the situation. He'd watched that and felt something, not surprise exactly, something that had already been shaped by a long time of knowing how Victoria Sinclair's attention was distributed. He didn't carry that as anger. He'd learned across 17 years that carrying things as anger only made them heavier. He just filed it where he filed most things, and the part of himself that had already accepted the shape of the situation and was now focused on what could actually be done. His phone buzzed. He looked at it, a number he didn't recognize, a text that read, "Mr. Brooks, Richard Marsh. I'd like to speak with you at 10:30 if you're still in the building. There are some things I want to share before the vote." Ethan read it twice. Then he typed, "I'm here." The boardroom adjacent to the 42nd floor conference suite was smaller than the room where the reception was happening. 12 chairs around a table, a wall screen currently displaying a static Sinclair Industries logo, a credenza along one wall with coffee that no one had touched. Richard Marsh was already there when Ethan arrived, seated at the middle of the table rather than the head, which Ethan read as intentional. He had a laptop open in front of him and his legal pad from earlier, and he looked up when Ethan came in with the expression of a man who had prepared something. "Thank you for coming." He gestured to the chair across from him, not the low one from earlier, just a chair. "Coffee? The coffee is genuinely terrible." "I'm fine." Ethan sat. Marsh looked at him for a moment. "I want to be transparent with you about what I'm about to share, because I think that's the right approach, and also because I suspect you'll see through anything else." A pause. "I've been making some calls. I figured you have a more interesting background than you led us to believe in the conference room." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I said Navy, 8 years. That's accurate." "It's accurate the way saying you've done some cooking when you're a Michelin-starred chef is accurate." Marsh turned the laptop so Ethan could see the screen. "I have a contact at the Department of Defense." What he was willing to share, without breaching classification, was that your service record includes specialized operations training and a deployment history that is, let me use his word, significant. Ethan looked at the screen. His face didn't change. "He used the word decorated," Marsh continued, and then said he couldn't say more and wished me luck, which, in my experience with defense contacts, means the actual record is considerably more detailed than the summary. A moment of quiet. "Why does this matter?" Ethan asked. "Because what happened tonight is going to be characterized by Tristan Caldwell's legal team as an assault by an unstable individual. That characterization relies on a version of you that doesn't hold up under scrutiny." Marsh leaned forward slightly. "A man with your background does not lose control in a crowded reception and make a reckless decision. Every person who knows anything about the training you received knows that what you did tonight was not impulsive. It was controlled. It was precise. And most importantly, the security footage." He paused. "I reviewed it 20 minutes ago. Tristan grabbed your daughter first. That's on camera, clearly and unambiguously, from 2 angles." Ethan absorbed this. "Okay," he said. "That's all I wanted to tell you tonight." Marsh closed the laptop. "The rest of this is going to unfold however it unfolds, and there are people in this building with significantly more resources than you who are going to try to shape that narrative. I wanted you to know that the facts exist and that I intend to make sure they're heard." He paused. "I'm telling you this because my job is to protect this company, and protecting this company means not letting a manufactured story stand unchallenged. Not because I'm doing you a favor. I understand the distinction. Good. Marsh picked up his coffee, reconsidered, put it back down. I'll ask you one more question, and you don't have to answer. What branch were you actually in within the Navy? A pause. The kind that doesn't get talked about, Ethan said. Marsh nodded slowly, like a man confirming something he'd already suspected. That's what I thought. He stood, extended his hand. Ethan shook it. The vote is in 90 minutes, Marsh said. Get some coffee. Not this coffee. Find a vending machine. Ethan almost smiled. Almost. Yeah. The thing about Tristan Caldwell that most people at Sinclair Industries didn't fully understand was that he was not stupid. That was a mistake people made because he wore his advantages so visibly, because the ease of his life was so obvious on the surface, because he laughed at his own jokes and expected rooms to rearrange themselves around him. People confused those things with not being intelligent, and that was an error. He was on the phone at 10:22 p.m., pacing the length of a private meeting room on the 41st floor that his assistant had cleared for him, speaking to a man named Gerald Weiss, who was his family's lead attorney and had been for 11 years and who had the voice of a man who had never lost sleep over anything he'd done professionally. The footage is a problem, Tristan said. He was keeping his voice even, but his free hand was clenching and unclenching with the specific rhythm of someone whose composure was being maintained by conscious effort. Marsh has already looked at it. What exactly does it show? It shows me taking her arm. A pause. It doesn't show what preceded it. There was a conversation. Did the conversation justify? She was being insolent. The word came out with more force than he intended. He heard it and adjusted. She was dismissive. I was asking a simple professional question and she turned to walk away without completing the Tristan. Weiss's voice was gentle in the specific way of someone exercising long patience. I'm going to stop you there because I need you to understand something. What you just described to me does not justify physical contact in any jurisdiction, under any reading of any professional conduct standard. Silence. What I need you to do, Weiss continued, is focus on the escalation, the father's response. That's where your ground is firmer. He grabbed my arm and twisted it in front of 200 people. Some of those people are board members. Do you understand what that? I understand. Believe me, I understand. And we will file and we will pursue it. But you need to be very careful about what story you're asking me to lead with. Because if the opposing story is my client put his hand on a young woman and her father removed it, and that's the story in every headline tomorrow. Another pause. Help me give the headline something different. Tristan stopped pacing. He stood near the window looking at the same city view as the floor above, different angle. His shoulder was fine. The man had done whatever he'd done with a specificity that left no real injury and no clean legal claim, and that precision was somehow more enraging than pain would have been. There are prepared statements, he said after a moment. I'm aware. Your father mentioned them. The plan was to run them after the vote, if it went wrong. And now? Now we might need them earlier. He pulled out a second phone from his jacket pocket, one he hadn't mentioned in the conference room, and looked at the screen. There are media contacts standing by, statements ready. The narrative was built for a different trigger, but it can be adjusted. He paused. Victoria Sinclair is already on thin ice with half the board. If tonight goes sideways, don't run anything until we talk again, Weiss said. Give me until 11. Tristan looked at the screen for a moment. You have until 11, he said. He hung up. He stood at the window for a while. Somewhere above him, a man in a $30 shirt was having a conversation that Tristan couldn't hear and couldn't control, and that bothered him in a way that was disproportionate to the actual stakes, which he recognized as a sign that he was letting something personal contaminate something professional. He'd been told his whole life not to do that. He pocketed the second phone and went to find his associates. Victoria Sinclair finally sat down at 10:38 p.m. She'd been on her feet for over 2 hours, working the room with the systematic thoroughness that she brought to every public obligation, and when she finally found a moment, a genuine moment, 2 minutes in a side corridor while her assistant rerouted a board member who'd been heading toward her, she leaned against the wall and closed her eyes for approximately 8 seconds. 8 seconds was what she allowed herself. Then she opened her eyes and looked at her phone. 3 messages from her communications director, 2 from the board chairman, 1 from a number she recognized, her father's medical facility, which was unusual at this hour, and which she couldn't deal with right now. Not tonight, not here. She put the phone away. The vote was in 80 minutes, and she had 3 undecided board members who were either going to hold the line or weren't, and the entire calculation had been complicated by an incident that she hadn't seen coming and hadn't prepared for and didn't know yet how to process. She was thinking about Ethan's face in the conference room, the complete absence of performance in it. Every other person in that room had been performing something. Tristan, obviously, running his post-incident charm offensive. Weiss's junior associate, who'd appeared from somewhere, performing controlled urgency. Even her own counsel performing the measured neutrality of professional detachment. And she herself had been performing the most carefully constructed thing in the room, a CEO, who was handling a crisis without taking a personal position on it. And then there was Ethan, who had walked into that room and stood near the door and told the truth in the most boring way possible and hadn't performed a single thing. She'd forgotten how much she used to find that quality both admirable and maddening. She still found it both. The thing she wasn't examining, the thing she'd been not examining for about an hour now, was Maya's face, standing in the conference room with that careful composure, the mark on her wrist that she'd been slightly too controlled about not drawing attention to, the look she'd given Victoria when Victoria had gone back to addressing the political logistics of the situation, a 23-year-old woman who was the best intern in her cohort and who had been grabbed at a company event and who had looked at her mother with an expression that Victoria was currently, actively, and deliberately not sitting with. She was not going to sit with that right now. There was a vote in 80 minutes. She pushed off the wall and walked back toward the reception. Tubs. At 10:55 p.m., the reception began its natural wind-down. The formal part of the evening, such as it had been, was over. The crowd had thinned. The people who had come purely for the social element were beginning to say their goodbyes. The careful, calibrated goodbyes of people who wanted to be remembered as having been present without being entangled in whatever was happening. The people who remained were the ones who had actual stakes in the vote, and their conversations had condensed from general networking into something more specific and more charged. Ethan had found Maya again. They were sitting in 2 chairs near the wall, a slight distance from the main activity of the room, not hiding, not performing, just occupying the space that was available. She'd taken her heels off. He'd noticed when she did it and hadn't said anything because she was 23 years old and had been on her feet for 3 hours, and he didn't have opinions about that. "Tell me something," she said, not looking at him, looking at the room. "When you were in the Navy, did you ever—" She stopped. "Did you ever do something that you knew was right and then have to sit around and wait to find out whether you were going to be punished for it?" He thought about that for a moment. "More than once," he said. "How did you handle it?" "Badly the first time. Less badly as it went on." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "What does less badly look like?" "You do the thing because it's the right thing to do. Then you accept that the thing and its consequences are separate events. The first one you control. The second one you mostly don't." She was quiet for a while. "That's hard." "Yeah, it is." "Dad." She said the word and then didn't follow it with anything for a moment. Just sat with it. "Thank you for coming tonight. I know this isn't what you signed up for when I said, come to my work thing." "You didn't sign me up for anything," he said. "I'd have done exactly what I did whether you invited me or not." "I know." A pause. "That's kind of the thing about you, actually." He looked at her. She was picking at the edge of her thumbnail, which was something she'd done since she was 7 years old when she was thinking through something. "You just do what needs doing, and then you don't make a big thing of it. You were always like that. When I was little and you picked me up early from school because I was upset about something, you never made me feel like it was a big deal for you to rearrange your day. You just showed up." A pause. "I didn't really understand until I got older that it was actually a big deal, that you actually rearranged your day, every time." He didn't say anything. "I think Mom never—" She stopped. "I don't want to say something unfair about Mom. Tonight's complicated enough." "You don't have to." "No, I know." She looked at the room. Another pause, longer. "I see her. I watch her work. I've been here 4 months, and I see how good she is at what she does, and I understand why she built what she built and why it mattered to her. I get it. I genuinely do. Her voice was even, measured, the voice of someone being careful with something fragile. And I also spent most of my childhood with you, not her. And I know that's not an accident, that's not circumstance, she made choices. And so did you. And the choices added up. Ethan said nothing. He looked at his daughter and said nothing because there was nothing to say that wouldn't either diminish what she was saying or try to shape it into something more comfortable, and she didn't need either of those things. After a while, Maya put her heels back on. I should go check in with Derek and Priya before the vote starts, she said. Okay. She stood, looked down at him for a moment. You don't have to stay for the vote. I know. But you're going to. Yeah, he said. I am. She nodded. And for a moment she had the exact same expression she'd had at 16, standing at the door of the apartment before her first date, when she'd looked at him and he'd looked at her. And no words had been necessary because they'd already said everything they needed to say to each other over the preceding 16 years, in the accumulated weight of every ordinary day. Then she was walking back across the room, heels clicking on the marble, professional and straight-backed and 23 years old, and Ethan watched her go and sat with the complicated feeling of raising a person well enough that they no longer needed you the way they used to. It wasn't loss. It was close to loss in texture, but it wasn't the same thing. He couldn't name it in words. He just let himself feel it, the way he'd learned to feel things, fully, without trying to resolve them. And then he set it aside and watched the room prepare itself for midnight. At 11:10 p.m., Richard Marsh came back into the main reception hall with a different expression than he'd left with. Ethan noticed it from across the room. Marsh was a man who managed his expression professionally, but something had changed in the set of his shoulders, the specific quality of his movement through the room. He crossed directly to Victoria Sinclair, interrupted the conversation she was in with a brief word to the board member she'd been speaking to, and pulled her 2 feet aside. Whatever he said to her took about 45 seconds. Victoria Sinclair's face didn't change. That was the tell. Not a change. The absence of one. The sudden stillness of someone who has just received information that is too significant to react to naturally. Then she said something. Marsh responded. She said something else. He nodded. She looked across the room, not at Ethan, at the spot near the window where Tristan Caldwell was standing with his associates. Ethan watched her look at him. He watched her face decide something. Then he watched Richard Marsh walk toward him, threading through the thinned crowd with the specific direction of a man who had something to deliver. Marsh stopped in front of him. He looked at Ethan with the careful eyes of a man who was about to say something precise. My assistant got further than expected, he said quietly. On your background. She found a contact who was more forthcoming than my DOD contact. Not classified material, just a clearer picture. He paused. I want to ask you something, and I need a straight answer. Okay. Your daughter, when you enrolled her at Sinclair Industries, did you know that her voting shares? He paused, choosing words. Did you know about the clause? Ethan looked at him. What clause? Marsh studied him for a moment. Reading him with the 31 years of reading people that was probably his most valuable professional asset. Then he said, I believe you. He put his hand in his jacket pocket. There's something you need to see. He produced a document, not the original, a copy, 2 pages, densely printed. He held it out. Ethan took it, read the first paragraph, stopped, read it again. The noise of the reception went slightly distant, the way noise sometimes did when something was drawing your full attention. He read the key section 3 times. Then he lowered the document and looked at Richard Marsh. This is accurate? He asked. Our corporate attorneys confirmed it 2 hours ago. It was in the original incorporation documents from when Maya joined the company's intern equity program. It's a guardian clause, an artifact from the program's early design, when the interns were sometimes younger. No one's looked at it in 3 years because no one expected it to matter. A pause. It matters tonight. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. The clause was clear, As Maya's legal guardian of record through her 23rd year, a status that had technically remained in place because neither of them had bothered with the paperwork to update it when she'd turned 18 because it hadn't seemed important, because he'd still been paying her phone bill anyway, and the legal technicality had just sat there, dormant. Ethan Brooks held authorization power over the activation of her voting shares in tonight's board restructuring vote. Maya had shares, small symbolic shares given to interns as part of a program designed to create early investment in the company. Nobody had been thinking about intern shares when they'd built the power play for tonight. Nobody had noticed that the guardian on record for the intern with shares was a man who had, as of approximately 2 hours ago, become central to the night's most visible incident. "Does Tristan Caldwell know?" Ethan asked. "Not yet," Marsh said. "Does Victoria?" "I told her 30 seconds ago." Ethan looked across the room. Victoria Sinclair was still standing where Marsh had left her, and she was looking at Ethan now with an expression he hadn't seen on her face in a very long time. Something that was a complicated mixture of things, and he had enough history with her to read it. It was the expression of a woman who had spent the entire evening trying to keep a man at a careful professional distance because the situation required it, and who had just discovered that the situation had reconfigured itself in a way that made that distance no longer possible. The vote was in 50 minutes. Ethan folded the document carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his sport coat. He was aware distantly of the irony. He'd come tonight because his daughter had asked him. He'd brought nothing. No agenda, no leverage, no play. Just himself, in a $30 shirt with creases he hadn't managed to iron out. And somehow that had landed him, improbably, at the center of everything. He looked at the document one more time through the fabric of his jacket, a habit he wasn't aware he had. Then he looked at the room. 50 minutes. The document in Ethan's jacket pocket weighed nothing. 2 pages of dense corporate language, a clause buried in the founding architecture of a program that nobody had thought about in 3 years. It weighed nothing physically, and it had changed the entire geometry of the night. He sat with that for a while, not with satisfaction. He didn't feel satisfaction, which was something people sometimes got wrong about him, the assumption that a tactical advantage produced pleasure. What he felt was more like the specific alertness of someone who has just realized they're standing in a different landscape than the one they thought they were in. The ground hadn't moved. His understanding of it had. He was still sitting near the wall when Victoria crossed the room toward him. She moved with purpose, which she always did, but there was something underneath the purpose tonight that was different, a quality he recognized from a long time ago, from the version of her that existed before she'd learned to completely manage the surface of herself in public. She sat down in the chair Maya had vacated without asking whether he minded. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "Richard told you," he said. "Richard told me." She had her hands folded in her lap, and she was looking at the middle distance rather than at him, which was the thing she did when she was thinking something she hadn't finished thinking. "Did you know? About the clause?" "No." She looked at him then, direct, reading him the way she'd always read people, which had always been one of the things about her he genuinely admired even when they were making each other miserable in other ways. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." A pause. She believed him. He could see it, the small adjustment of something in her posture that said the question had been answered and filed. 48 minutes, she said, more to herself than to him. "I know." She was quiet for a moment, then, "The clause is real. Our attorneys went through the original documents twice. It's not ambiguous." She stopped. "Which means that whether or not you want to be involved in any of this, I'm already involved." "Yes." The word was flat. Not unkind, just accurate. "You are." He looked at her profile. She had the look she got when she was carrying too many things and refusing to put any of them down, which was a look he'd seen many times across many years, and which had always produced in him the same complicated mixture of concern and frustration that he suspected she produced in him deliberately, not out of manipulation, but simply because that was the effect of watching someone be brilliant, and also entirely unwilling to ask for help. "Victoria," he said. "Don't." Her voice was quiet. "I haven't said anything yet." "I know what you're about to say?" "Then you know I'm not wrong." She pressed her lips together. That was the tell. She'd always done that when she couldn't argue with something and didn't want to concede it out loud. Maya is okay, Ethan said, physically, but she was grabbed at a company event, and the first thing this company did was pull everyone into a conference room and focus on the political optics of it. And I think you know that. I handled it the way the situation, I know how you handled it, and I know why. I'm not attacking you. He kept his voice the same level it always was, which was probably, he knew, its own form of frustrating. I'm telling you that she saw it, and she's 23, not 8. She understood what she was watching. A long silence. I know, Victoria said. She said it quietly, and something in the two words was different from her usual register, less managed, closer to the surface. He let it sit without adding anything to it, because he'd learned a long time ago that the worst thing you could do when Victoria Sinclair said something genuine was rush to respond. She has your composure, she said after a moment. She has her own composure. She built it herself. I know that too. A pause. She's extraordinary. You know that. I do. You had more to do with it than I did. The sentence landed in the space between them with the weight of something that had been true for a long time and hadn't been said in those exact words. He didn't argue with it. Arguing with it would have required him to minimize something that was accurate, and he didn't do that. He said, You built something she can step into. That matters too. Victoria looked at him. For a moment, she looked very tired, and he was reminded that she was 30 years old and had been running a company for 14 months under circumstances she didn't discuss, and that she was not, despite all appearances, indestructible. The vote, she said, pulling back to the surface. If the clause is real and your authorization is required, then I decide whether to use it. Yes. And if I use it, it counts toward the final tally. Yes. And the Caldwells don't have enough votes without it going their way. Our projections have it within 2 votes either direction, which means... She stopped. Yes. It could be determinative. He nodded slowly, looked at the room. Tristan Caldwell was across the space, talking to one of his associates, his body language different now than it had been an hour ago. Less loose, more contained, the posture of a man running internal calculations. Does he know yet? Ethan asked. Richard was going to give it until 11:15 before it had to be formally disclosed as part of the vote documentation. He checked his watch. 11:08. 7 minutes. 7 minutes, she confirmed. Neither of them said what both of them were thinking, which was that 7 minutes was enough time for a lot of things to change. Gerald Weiss called Tristan at 11:09 p.m. Tristan stepped away from his associates and took the call in the corridor outside the main hall, the same corridor where Marsh had stood 2 hours earlier with his notepad and his careful eyes. Tell me, Tristan said. I've been reviewing the incorporation documents for the intern equity program, Weiss said. No preamble. That was how you knew something was serious with Weiss, the complete absence of his usual measured buildup. There's a guardian clause in the share authorization protocol. Tristan's hand tightened on the phone. Say that again. Weiss said it again, slower, with more specificity, and as he spoke, Tristan stood very still in the corridor and felt something happen in his chest that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but lived in the neighborhood of both. The intern, he said when Weiss finished. Maya Brooks. Her shares are small, symbolic in normal circumstances. But tonight is not normal circumstances. No, Weiss said. Tonight is not. A silence. And the guardian, Tristan said. The name on the documentation. Ethan Brooks, her father. The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere in the building, a ventilation system ran with a low, continuous hum. That's not a coincidence, Tristan said slowly. I'm not sure it's... That man walked into this building tonight and positioned himself. Tristan, Weiss's voice sharpened slightly. I need you to listen to me carefully. Do not say anything in the next 45 minutes that you will not want repeated in a deposition. Do you understand me? A beat. Yes. Good. Now, the footage is a problem. The guardian clause is a problem. The incident itself, as it has been framed by Marsh's team, is a problem. A pause. But we have the prepared statements. We have the media contacts. And we have something that the other side does not have yet, which is a coherent alternative narrative. What narrative? That Ethan Brooks knew about the clause before tonight. That his presence at this event was not accidental. That the incident with your arm was manufactured to create a sympathetic framing before exercising a form of covert leverage in a corporate vote. Tristan was quiet for a moment. Is that provable? It doesn't have to be proven tonight. It has to be plausible enough to muddy the water before midnight. We release the statements at 11:30. They go to 6 outlets simultaneously. By the time anyone can fact-check them, the vote is already disrupted enough to require postponement. A pause. A postponed vote is not a loss. It's time. Tristan looked at the wall. Do it, he said. The first statement hit at 11:31 p.m. Richard Marsh's phone buzzed first. A news alert from one of the financial outlets his monitoring service flagged. He read the headline, and something in his face went flat in the specific way of a man who has been in corporate law long enough to recognize a manufactured narrative on first contact. He crossed the room in 45 seconds and put the phone in front of Victoria Sinclair. She read it. Her expression didn't change, which meant it had changed internally in ways she wasn't showing. The headline read, Sinclair Industries vote clouded by claims of insider manipulation. Father of intern invoked as proxy voter with prior knowledge of share clause. The body of the piece, he'd scrolled quickly to skim it, was thin. No sources named. Language carefully hedged with sources suggest and questions have been raised. But it had a quote attributed to a spokesperson for the Caldwell family. We are concerned that this evening's events may not be as spontaneous as they appear, and that individuals with undisclosed corporate interests may have positioned themselves to influence tonight's vote through unconventional means. Victoria handed the phone back to Marsh without speaking. There are 5 more pieces, Marsh said. Different outlets. Same story, slightly different framing. They went out within the same 2-minute window. Coordinated. Obviously. She looked at him. How long have they had those prepared? Based on the level of detail? He paused. At least a week, maybe longer. The number landed. She let it. A week. The statements had been drafted before tonight, before any incident, before any clause had been discovered. The plan had been in place before the reception began. The statements were a contingency weapon, built and loaded, waiting for a trigger. They were going to use it regardless, she said. If the vote went wrong, if anything gave them an opening. Yes, Marsh's voice was very even. They came here tonight with a narrative pre-built. The incident gave them a better version of the trigger than they'd planned for, but it didn't change the fundamental architecture. He paused. This was not an improvised response to Ethan Brooks. Ethan Brooks was an unexpected variable in a plan that existed before he walked through the door. Victoria stood with that for a moment. Then she said, I need to talk to Ethan. She found him standing near the main entrance, reading something on his phone. He'd found the article himself, or Maya had sent it to him. He was reading it with the still attention of someone absorbing information without reacting to it. He looked up when she approached. I saw, he said. They were ready before tonight. Marsh thinks at least a week. He nodded, not surprised. Not performing unsurprise either. Just someone receiving information and integrating it. The incident, he said. Tristan grabbing Maya. We think it may have been intentional. She kept her voice low. The room was thinning further, but there were still people within earshot. Not necessarily targeting Maya specifically, but creating an incident. Something they could use as a hook for the narrative. Brooks was provoked. Brooks responded, Now we question his motives. She paused. Except the footage shows his son grabbed her first, which is the part of the plan that went wrong for them. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. She watched his face do the thing it did when he was processing something that had personal weight. Not anger exactly, just a brief controlled tightening. Then it smoothed back out. They used my daughter, he said. Flat, factual. We believe so. Yes. He looked at the far wall, then back at her. What do you need from me? And there it was. The thing about Ethan Brooks that she'd spent 17 years alternately being grateful for and failing to adequately acknowledge. He didn't perform outrage. He didn't demand the situation center his feelings. He asked what was needed because that was the shape his thinking took, had always taken. Not what does this mean for me, but what needs to be done. She'd taken that quality for granted once. She wouldn't say that out loud tonight, but she was thinking it, and the part of herself that was honest when she wasn't performing. I need to know whether you'll use the authorization, she said, and I need to know before 11:50 because the vote convenes at midnight and Marsh needs time to properly document it. What happens if I don't use it? We may lose by 1 vote, possibly 2. She was direct, the way she was always direct when there was no benefit to being otherwise. The Caldwells take 2 additional board seats. My position becomes untenable within 6 months, probably less, and the people who built this trap get exactly what they came here to get. And if I do use it, we hold, assuming the rest of our projections are accurate. A pause. It's not guaranteed, but it's the difference between fighting from a position and not fighting at all. He held her gaze for a moment. I want something, he said. Okay? Not about the vote, before I sign anything. She waited. Maya, he said. Public acknowledgement. Not corporate language, not a press release drafted by your communications team. A statement from you about what happened tonight, what actually happened. The grab. The fact that this company's first response was to manage the optics rather than address what was done to her. He paused. She deserves that. She deserves to not have tonight get buried in corporate narrative management. Victoria held his gaze. Something in her face shifted, not dramatically, just a small movement, the particular quality of someone encountering a truth they'd already known and hadn't yet said. And the investigation, he said, not internal, independent. If those statements were prepared in advance, if this was planned, then there are people in or adjacent to this company who were part of it, board members possibly. That has to go somewhere. It can actually go somewhere. Those are significant asks, she said. I know. A pause. Is there a third? She asked. He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not confrontational. More like a man deciding whether to say a thing he'd been not saying for a very long time. The third one isn't about the company, he said. She waited. Maya, he said again. She talked to me tonight. About choices. About what added up. He didn't look away from her. She wasn't angry. That's almost worse, actually. She's processed it. She's built her life around what was there, and she's done it well. And she's not asking for anything to be different. But she's 23, and she has her mother's cheekbones and my eyes, and she figured out a long time ago that she was mostly going to get one of us at a time. A pause. You built something she can step into, and she will. She'll do remarkable things in it. But she needed someone to be there on a Tuesday afternoon when she was 12 and had a bad day. That was me. And that's fine. That was my choice, and I'd make it again. Another pause. But she's here now, in your building, in your world. And what happened tonight happened on your floor in your company, and your first 3 seconds of response were not about her. The silence between them was the kind that had weight. Victoria said nothing. That's the third thing, Ethan said. It's not a condition. You can't legislate it. He paused. Just, she's in the room, that's all. At 11:43 p.m., the main reception hall was down to its essential personnel, board members, senior legal staff, a handful of executives. The Caldwell contingent clustered in a way that had become visibly oppositional to the room's other clusters. The party was over. What remained was what the party had always been cover for. Tristan Caldwell saw Ethan Brooks cross the room at 11:44 p.m., moving toward the corridor that led to the formal boardroom, accompanied by Richard Marsh, and 2 steps behind, Victoria Sinclair. He watched them go. His senior associate, a man named Paul, who had been with the family for 6 years and who never expressed opinions until asked, said quietly, "They've found something." "I know," Tristan said. "The statements are running, all 6 outlets." "I know. The question is whether I know, Paul." His voice came out sharper than he intended. He adjusted. "Get Weiss on the phone. Tell him we need to move to phase 2. "Which is?" Tristan looked at the corridor where Ethan Brooks had just disappeared. "We challenge the Guardian Clause," he said. "We have 20 minutes to file a procedural objection before the vote convenes. If we can create enough uncertainty about its legal validity, on what grounds? On the grounds that it was never intended to apply in this context. On the grounds that it's an artifact of a program design that didn't anticipate this scenario. On any grounds that take 20 minutes to argue and 10 seconds to allege." Paul was already on his phone. Tristan looked at the corridor. The man had walked into this building in a $30 shirt. He'd done one thing, quietly, for a reason that had nothing to do with corporate strategy, and the ripples of it had rearranged the entire evening. It was not impressive, Tristan would not say impressive, but it was something that sat in his chest and made him feel, for the first time in a long time, like he'd underestimated a variable in a calculation he'd thought he had complete. He didn't like the feeling. He also couldn't entirely dismiss it. The boardroom at midnight had the atmosphere of something that had been inevitable for a long time finally arriving. 12 chairs. 8 of them filled, 5 Sinclair board members, 2 independent directors, and the Caldwell family's lead board representative, an older man named Franklin Caldwell, who was Tristan's uncle, and who had the specific composure of a man who had been doing this for 40 years and believed he had seen every version of every room. He had not seen this version. Richard Marsh laid the Guardian Clause documentation on the table at 11:56 p.m. in front of the independent directors who would rule on procedural matters, and walked through it in 6 minutes and 20 seconds of language that was clear and specific and left very little room for legitimate objection. Weiss's procedural challenge arrived via fax, an actual fax, which said something about the speed at which it had been assembled, at 11:58 p.m. The independent directors looked at each other. One of them, a woman named Sandra Okafor, who had been on boards for 23 years and had the permanently skeptical expression of someone who had been handed thin arguments framed as serious ones before, said, "This is a stalling document, not a legitimate procedural challenge." Franklin Caldwell said, from across the table, "Sandra, I've read it, Franklin. I'm familiar with the incorporation structure of the intern program. This clause was not an oversight, and it was not ambiguous." She set the fax down. We proceed. At 11:59 p.m., Ethan Brooks sat at a table with a document in front of him and a pen in his hand. Marsh had walked him through it twice, in the corridor, in the 7 minutes between leaving the reception hall and arriving here. The authorization was simple, a signature confirming that he, as the guardian of record for Maya Brooks, authorized the activation of her voting shares in the midnight board vote. It did not require him to have any opinion about corporate governance or the specific resolution being voted on. It required only his authorization for the shares to be cast according to Maya's instruction, which she had given in writing, a small, slightly crumpled form she'd filled out at 11:51 p.m. in the corridor, leaning against the wall with Priya holding a clipboard because there was nothing better to write on. Maya had looked at the form. Then she'd looked at her father. "You don't have to," he'd said. "Whatever you want to do with them." "I know what I want to do," she'd said. She'd looked at Victoria, who was standing 6 feet away. Then she'd looked back at the form. "I know what's right." She'd signed it. Now the form was in the boardroom, and Ethan sat with the pen. He was thinking about something specific, which was the way Tristan Caldwell's grip had tightened when Ethan had told him to let go. The deliberateness of it. The calculation underneath the aggression. "I can do this. There's nothing you can actually do about it. You don't have enough weight in this room to matter." The plan had been built before tonight. The statements had been written before tonight. The intent to manufacture an incident, to frame a narrative, to use whatever pieces came to hand, including the wrist of a 23-year-old woman trying to step back from a conversation she was trying to leave. All of it had been assembled in advance by people who believed that the room was already theirs, that the only remaining question was the clean execution of something that had already been decided. He thought about Maya at 12, at 16, at 19, starting college, calling him from a dorm payphone because her cell had died and she'd had a bad day and she'd just needed to hear a voice she trusted. He signed the document. The vote took 11 minutes. Afterward, in the corridor, Tristan Caldwell and his uncle walked past the room where Ethan was sitting with Marsh and a cold cup of coffee. Tristan's pace was controlled. His face was the face of a man running an internal calculation about next moves, not a man who had lost something. Not yet. Not visibly. Not in a way he'd admit. He glanced at Ethan through the glass panel of the door. Ethan looked back. Neither of them said anything. The corridor was glass and marble, and the kind of expensive quiet that existed in buildings built to absorb sound. For a moment it was just two men looking at each other through a pane of glass, and then Tristan looked away, and he and his uncle continued down the corridor toward the elevator. Franklin Caldwell did not look at Ethan at all. Richard Marsh said, without looking up from his documents, "That's going to be a long night for Gerald Weiss." Ethan picked up his cold coffee, considered it, put it back down. "Where's Maya?" he asked. "Last I saw, she was in the reception hall with the other interns." A pause. "She's fine. Actually fine, not performed fine." "Yeah." Ethan looked at the glass door through which Tristan Caldwell had just walked. "She usually is." Outside the window at the end of the corridor, the city was still doing what it did. The lights in the grid below had not changed. Whatever had shifted tonight had shifted in a room that the city below didn't know existed, over a vote that hadn't made the front pages yet, involving people the majority of the city had never heard of. That was how most things that mattered actually worked, Ethan knew. Not in the loud places. In the rooms where people sat across tables from each other and decided with no audience and no ceremony what was going to happen next. He'd been in a lot of those rooms, across a long time, in different contexts. The stakes had been different. The furniture had been less expensive. The thing at the center of every room had always been the same, though. Someone trying to hold something that was worth holding, someone else trying to take it. And somewhere in between, the question of who was willing to do what it actually took. He sat in the boardroom chair and let the quiet settle around him, and outside the window the city went on, indifferent and enormous. And the night was not over yet, but something in it had shifted toward a shape that might eventually resolve into something you could look at without flinching. Maybe. He didn't count on things before they were done. He knew better than that. The vote result was not announced publicly that night. That was deliberate. Marsh's recommendation, which Victoria had accepted without argument, because a midnight announcement in a building still containing Caldwell family representatives and their legal team was a situation with unnecessary variables. The result would be formally communicated through proper channels in the morning. The independent directors had it. The documentation was complete. What happened in that boardroom at 12:11 a.m. was real and recorded and witnessed, and the morning would make it official. What that meant practically was that the 42nd floor of the Hartwell Grand spent the hour between midnight and 1 in the morning in a state of suspended atmosphere. Everyone knowing something had been decided, most people not knowing exactly what. The Caldwell contingent departing with the specific controlled efficiency of people who had made calls and received information and were now operating in response to it. Tristan left without speaking to anyone from the Sinclair side. His uncle left 3 minutes after him. Their departure had the quality of a retreat that was trying very hard not to look like one. Ethan watched them go from the corridor and then went to find his daughter. She was in the reception hall, sitting on the floor next to the window, actually on the floor, back against the glass, shoes off again, talking on her phone in the low voice of someone who had been awake too long and was running on the specific fuel of having been through something. Priya was sitting beside her, also on the floor, both of them with the slightly disheveled composure of people who had dropped their professional performance and were just being people now. Ethan stopped in the doorway and looked at her. She saw him. Something moved across her face. Relief, he thought, mixed with something more complicated. She said something into the phone and hung up. "Hey," she said. "Hey." He walked over and sat down on the floor next to her, which was not comfortable and which he did without hesitation, because she was sitting on the floor, and the thing to do was sit on the floor. Priya looked at him with the expression of someone who had just recalibrated a person they'd underestimated earlier in the evening. "I'm going to get some water," she said, which was a graceful exit, and she stood and walked toward the catering station. Maya leaned her head back against the window. The city was still out there beyond the glass, 4 inches behind her skull, all those lights. "Did it work?" she asked. The vote held. She exhaled, not dramatically, just a slow release of something she'd been holding. "Good. The investigation is going forward, independent," Marsh is handling the appointment of outside counsel tonight. Tonight? He didn't want to give anyone time to move anything. A pause. He's thorough. Yeah. She was quiet for a moment. The statements, the ones they released, they'll get addressed. The footage exists. The timeline of when those statements were drafted exists. It'll take time, but it'll get addressed. She nodded slowly. Then, people saw them tonight. Before any of that gets addressed, people saw them and some of them believed them. A pause. That's how it works, isn't it? The correction never travels as far as the original. Usually not, he said. He wasn't going to tell her otherwise. She was smart enough to know otherwise. Are you going to be okay, legally? The assault claim, Marsh doesn't think it goes anywhere. The footage is clear about what happened and in what order. He paused. I'm not particularly worried about it. She looked at him sideways. You're not worried about a lot of things that most people would be worried about. I'm worried about plenty of things. Like what? He thought about it. Whether you're eating enough. Whether the transmission on my truck is going to hold through winter. Whether the 17-year-old I train on Tuesday mornings is going to make the right decision about the scholarship he's been offered. Maya was quiet for a moment. You're worried about a teenager's scholarship decision. Kid's got a full ride to a school that's wrong for him. He doesn't know how to tell his parents. Dad, he'll figure it out, but I'm watching it. She made a sound that started as something else and landed as a laugh. Genuine, slightly exhausted, the laugh of someone who had been through too much in one night and had arrived at the far side of it where things that weren't funny were briefly funny anyway. He let her laugh. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, how's your wrist? She flexed her fingers. It's fine, really fine, not the kind of fine I said earlier. Okay. Dad. She paused. What he did? Tristan. I've been thinking about it. The whole thing was... They planned it. They used me as a... I know. And I keep thinking about how I felt when he grabbed me in the room. Not scared exactly. Just suddenly very aware of how many people in that room had decided I wasn't worth the risk of getting involved. She turned her head and looked at him. And then I turned, and you were already moving. He didn't say anything. You didn't hesitate, she said. No. Why not? Because there were 200 people in that room, and any one of them could have... Because you're my kid, he said. Simple. No additional architecture around it. She looked at him for a long time. I know I don't say it enough, she said. I don't think I say it enough. You don't have to say it. I want to say it. She sat up slightly straighter against the window. Thank you. For tonight and for all of it. For every Tuesday afternoon and every school thing and every time I called because I had a bad day and you always picked up. She paused. You always picked up. Of course I did. It's not of course. It's not a given. A lot of people don't. A pause. You always did. He looked at the middle distance for a moment. You were worth picking up for, he said. She put her head on his shoulder, which she hadn't done in years, in public, probably not since she was about 16. He didn't move. He sat with it the way he sat with most things, without trying to turn it into something else, without needing it to last longer than it lasted. After a while, Priya came back with 3 bottles of water, looked at the 2 of them against the window, and sat back down on the other side of Maya without saying anything. She handed the water around. The 3 of them sat on the floor of the 42nd floor reception hall as the city did what cities do at 1 in the morning, and nobody said anything for a little while, and that was fine. Victoria found them there at 1:17 a.m. She'd been in 3 consecutive conversations, Marsh, the board chairman, her communications director on the phone, and she'd been managing the immediate aftermath of the vote result with the efficiency she brought to crisis management, which was considerable, which was one of the things she was genuinely best at. She'd sent 4 messages, made 2 calls, drafted the framework of a morning statement, and then she'd looked across the room and seen Ethan sitting on the floor with their daughter's head on his shoulder, and she'd stood there for a moment and not moved. She crossed the room slowly. Priya saw her coming and stood with the quiet discretion of someone who understood when to give space, murmuring something about needing to find Derek. Maya lifted her head from Ethan's shoulder. She looked at Victoria with an expression that was tired and open in a way it hadn't been earlier in the evening. The specific openness that came from having been through something and come out the other side of it with the armor slightly looser. "Hi," Maya said. "Hi." Victoria stopped about 3 feet away. She looked at her daughter. "How's your wrist?" "It's fine." "I should have—" She stopped, started again. "In the conference room, earlier. I should have— The first thing I said should have been about you. Not about the vote." She paused. "I know that." Maya was quiet. "I'm not going to tell you it was complicated," Victoria said, "because it was complicated, and that's also not the point. The point is that you were in a room with a mark on your wrist, and I spent the first 10 minutes managing political optics." She held Maya's gaze. "I'm sorry." The silence was the kind that had texture. "Okay," Maya said after a moment. "Not it's fine. Not I forgive you. Just okay." The specific word of someone who is receiving something and putting it somewhere real rather than immediately processing it into reassurance for the other person. Victoria had enough self-awareness to recognize that and enough discipline to not push past it. She looked at Ethan then. He was watching her with the same even attention he'd given everything tonight. Not cold, not warm, just present and observant and not performing anything. "The conditions you named," she said. "Yeah. The investigation is already in motion. Independent counsel, Marsh is handling it tonight." She paused. "The public acknowledgement, I'm going to make a statement tomorrow. About Maya. About what happened, not corporate language." A pause. "You were right that she deserves that." Ethan nodded. "The third thing," she said. He waited. "I've been thinking about what you said in the reception hall." She held his gaze steadily. "I'm not going to promise things I don't know how to keep yet. I'm not built the way you're built, and I've been this way for 30 years, and I can't just—" She stopped. "But I'm going to try. And I know that's not the same as doing, and I know you know the difference better than most people." "I know the difference," he said. "I'm asking you to let me try." A moment passed. "She's not 8 anymore," he said. "She doesn't need the same things she needed at 8. She needs—" He thought about it. "She needs to know you see her, not the intern, not the asset, not the proof that your genetics produce something remarkable. Her." He paused. "That's the whole thing." Victoria looked at Maya. Maya was looking back at her mother with that same tired, open expression, and for a moment the two of them were just looking at each other. The same cheekbones, the same quality of intelligence in the eyes, the same capacity for stubbornness that had driven Ethan quietly insane across 17 years. "I see you," Victoria said. Quiet, direct, the way she said things when she'd stopped managing the delivery. Maya held her mother's gaze. "I know," she said, and then, "I'm figuring out how to let you." Victoria sat down on the floor, in her CEO suit at 1 in the morning, on the marble floor of the reception hall. She sat next to her daughter and put her back against the window and looked at the room. Ethan looked at the two of them and said nothing. He was thinking about the long arithmetic of the last 17 years, all the Tuesday afternoons and school pickups and cereal dinners, the years of showing up without anyone watching or recording or acknowledging it. You didn't do those things for acknowledgement. You did them because they were the right things to do and because the person who needed you was worth being there for. He'd never needed a room full of people to understand that. He'd always been fine with not being understood. At 2:30 a.m., the building was mostly empty. Cleaning staff had appeared with the specific quiet efficiency of people who worked the hours when everyone else was gone, and the reception hall was being restored to the condition it had been in before 200 people in one very complicated evening had moved through it. Ethan stood at the elevator with Maya. She had her shoes in her hand again. She was going to ride with Priya, who had reappeared with Derek in tow, both of them with the slightly stunned energy of people who had attended an event that had significantly exceeded their expectations for what a corporate reception could contain. "I'll call you tomorrow," Maya said. "Okay?" "Not because anything's wrong, just I'll call." "Okay." She looked at him for a moment. "Go home and eat something real." "I will." "What are you going to eat?" A pause. "Eggs." That's allowed. She smiled, and it was the full one, the one that started in her chest. Drive safe. She stepped into the elevator with Derek and Priya. The doors closed. He stood there for a moment in the lobby corridor, in the quiet of a building winding down toward morning, and let the night settle around him. Victoria caught him at the ground floor elevator bank at 2:44 a.m. She'd taken a different elevator, or finished something, or just moved slower. He wasn't sure. She came out of a side corridor with her jacket over her arm and her phone in her hand, and she looked, for the first time tonight, genuinely tired. Not the managed tiredness of someone performing exhaustion for effect. Just tired. I keep thinking, she said without preamble, about what Marsh told me. About your record. He didn't have much. He had enough to understand that what you did tonight was not a man losing his temper. She paused. And I keep thinking about the fact that I didn't know. That I've known you that we have a child together, and I didn't know. You never asked, he said. Not accusatory, just a fact. I know. She was quiet for a moment. You never offered. No. Why? He thought about how to answer that honestly. Because what I did before wasn't something I wanted to carry into after. And after was Maya, and the apartment, and figuring out how to do homework help when I hadn't been in a classroom in 8 years. A pause. The before part wasn't relevant. It is relevant, she said. It explains... She stopped. It explains a lot of things about how you move through the world, how you handled tonight, how you've always... She paused again. Why didn't you ever... She didn't finish the sentence. He looked at her for a moment. Why didn't I ever what? He said. She looked at the floor, then back up. Make it harder. For me. Any of it. The custody arrangement, the years when I was barely present, I walked away from a marriage and a daughter and built something else, and you took care of her and you never made it a weapon. Any of it. He was quiet for a long moment. Because making it a weapon would have hurt her, he said. Victoria absorbed that. That simple? She said. That's simple. She looked at him for a while. Something in her face was doing something it didn't do in public, which was showing what was actually there. Not the CEO, not the political calculation, just a 30-year-old woman standing in a lobby at 3 a.m, reckoning with some arithmetic she'd been putting off for a long time. I owe you more than I've ever... She started. You don't owe me anything, he said. And then because he was trying to be honest, you owe Maya. That's different. I know the difference. Yeah, he said. You do. The lobby was quiet around them. A security guard at the main desk was pointedly looking at his monitor. The cleaning crew had moved to a different floor. The building held the specific hollow quality of late night, when all the noise people made in it was gone, and you could hear the structure itself. What happens now? She asked. With the investigation. The Caldwells. Marsh handles it. You handle what you can handle on the corporate side. And eventually, whatever was built before tonight gets taken apart in the light where people can see it. He paused. That's going to take time. It's going to get ugly. Yes. They have resources. So does the footage, he said. And a paper trail that begins 2 weeks before tonight. Marsh will find it. She nodded slowly. And you? What about me? You go back. She said it like she was testing the shape of the sentence. To your training center. Your Tuesday kid with the scholarship problem. Your truck with the transmission issues. Yeah. Just back. That's my life, he said simply. It's a good life. She looked at him for a long moment. There was something in her expression that he recognized from a very long time ago. Before the company, before the careers that had diverged so dramatically, before all of it. Something from the version of her that existed before she'd built the armor that made her very good at what she did and also cost things he suspected she thought about more than she showed. Ethan, she said. Yeah. I'm sorry. She said it directly, the way she said things when she'd stopped managing the delivery. For how things went. For the years when Maya needed more than one parent showing up and I was... A pause. I was doing something I thought mattered more than it did. Or I told myself it mattered more than it did. I don't know which is true. Maybe both. He was quiet. I'm not asking you to. She stopped. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted to say it. He looked at her for a while. I know you loved her, he said finally. I never thought you didn't. I thought you loved what you were building more for a long time, but I knew you loved her. She held his gaze. I did, she said. I do. Tell her that, he said, in the way she can hear it. Not the big statements, the small things, the Tuesday afternoons now, the calls back when she calls. A pause. She's remarkably forgiving for someone who had a lot to forgive. Don't waste that. Victoria nodded. Something in her face looked like it was working to hold its shape. Okay, she said. He nodded once. Then he picked up his jacket from where he'd set it on a lobby bench. He'd been carrying it since the 11th floor. It was too warm for a jacket in the building, and he walked toward the main exit. He pushed through the door, and the night air hit him, cooler than inside. The city smell of late night that was different from the day smell, and he stood for a moment on the sidewalk outside the Hartwell Grand and breathed it in. His truck was in the parking structure 2 blocks east. The drive home was 40 minutes if the highway was clear, longer if it wasn't. He had a 6 a.m. class at the training center. 12 people who had signed up for the Tuesday morning session and would show up whether or not he'd been awake until 3, dealing with corporate board votes and a shareholder conspiracy. He'd be there. He started walking toward the parking structure. The city around him had the particular quality of very late night or very early morning, depending on how you were counting, sparse traffic, the sounds of the place settling into its overnight rhythms, a few people moving on the sidewalks for reasons that were their own. The buildings were lit in the way buildings stayed lit when no one was in them, the automatic ongoing brightness of things that didn't know when to turn themselves off. He walked the 2 blocks at his normal pace, not fast, not slow. His shoulder was fine, his hand was steady. He was tired in the way that came from a long day rather than from any of the things that had happened in it, because the things that had happened in it were the kind he'd learned, across a long time, to keep outside the place where fatigue lived. The parking structure was mostly empty. His truck was on the 3rd level, the same blue Ford F-150 he'd had for 6 years, with a small dent in the rear panel from a parking lot incident in 2022 that he'd kept meaning to fix and hadn't. He got in, started the engine, listened to the transmission for a moment. It turned over without complaint, which was either good or just a reprieve. He pulled out of the structure, paid the overnight fee at the booth, and merged onto the empty street. On the seat beside him, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it at the next red light. A text from Maya. Just checking you got out okay? Eat the eggs. I love you. He set the phone back down and drove. The highway was clear, 40 minutes, maybe less. He had eggs at home, and he was going to make them, and in 4 hours he had a class to run, and in 3 days he had a conversation with a 17-year-old about a scholarship decision, and the investigation would unfold over weeks and months in rooms he probably wouldn't be in, and the morning statement would be made, and the Caldwells would respond the way people with resources responded when a plan they'd built carefully was coming apart, and all of it would take the time it took. He drove. The city fell behind him and the highway opened up, and the night was wide and dark, in the way it got when you cleared the density of the downtown lights. And somewhere to the east, the sky had the very faint suggestion of not quite black, that meant morning was on its way, hours out still but already organizing itself in the dark. He put the window down 2 inches and let the air come in. He was thinking about Maya's head on his shoulder, on the floor of the reception hall, the weight of it. The specific, uncomplicated trust of it, which was not nothing, was very much not nothing, coming from a 23-year-old who had her own life and her own competence and her own fully formed opinions about what he should have for dinner. He'd built that. Not alone. She'd built most of it herself, the way people built themselves. But he'd been there. He'd been the consistent thing in the room. That was the work. Not the classified files, not the things that had happened overseas in places that didn't get talked about, not tonight with Tristan Caldwell or the boardroom or the clause in the intern equity program. The work was the Tuesday afternoons, the calls picked up, the honest answers to hard questions, the floor of a reception hall at 1 in the morning because that was where she was. The strongest he'd ever felt in his life was not a moment anyone would have recognized as strength from the outside. It was the afternoon Maya was 12 and had come home crying about something a girl at school had said, and he'd sat on the couch with her for 2 hours and said almost nothing, just been there, and eventually she'd fallen asleep against him, and he'd stayed very still so he didn't wake her. Nobody had needed him to be anything in that moment except present. He'd been present. He drove through the night toward home, and the transmission held, and the eggs were waiting, and in 4 hours there was work to do. And that was enough. That had always been enough. The eggs were overcooked. He'd gotten home at 3:22 a.m., stood in the kitchen for 4 minutes deciding whether he was actually hungry or just following his daughter's instructions, and then made the eggs anyway because the alternative was going to bed on an empty stomach. And he'd learned somewhere around age 35 that he slept badly when he did that. He'd been distracted, standing at the stove thinking about the drive, about the night, about nothing specific. And he'd left them on the heat 30 seconds too long and the edges had gone rubbery. He ate them anyway, standing at the counter looking at the dark window above the sink, the city outside doing its overnight thing. They tasted like eggs. That was enough. He was asleep by 3:51 a.m., and his alarm went off at 5:40, and he did not feel rested, but he'd operated on significantly less sleep in significantly higher stakes circumstances. So he got up, made coffee that was better than the coffee at the Hartwell Grand, and drove to the training center. The 6 a.m. class had 11 people instead of 12. Someone had texted a cancellation at 5:15, which he hadn't seen until he arrived. The 11 who showed up did the work, and he ran the class the way he always ran it, with the specific attention of someone who understood that what looked like physical training was also, underneath, something else. Teaching people how their bodies worked under stress. Teaching them to breathe when breathing was hard. Teaching them that the thing they thought was their limit usually wasn't. Afterward, when the class had cleared out and he was wiping down mats, his phone rang. Richard Marsh, 8:47 a.m. "You're up early," Ethan said. "I haven't been to sleep." Marsh's voice had the specific texture of a man who had been running on coffee and professional momentum for too many hours. "I wanted you to hear this before it hits the news." Ethan set down the cleaning cloth. "Okay." "Our outside counsel spent the night working through the documents, the prepared statements, the media contacts, the timeline of when everything was built." A pause. "It goes deeper than we thought. There are email chains going back 6 weeks, internal Caldwell family communications that were accessible through a third-party vendor that used to coordinate the media outreach. The vendor had poor security practices, and our digital forensics team got into it legally through a discovery pre-filing." "How deep?" 2 board members. Not Caldwell family, but connected to them through a separate business arrangement that wasn't disclosed during their board appointments. They were feeding internal Sinclair information to the Caldwell team in the weeks before the vote. Vote projections, internal dissent among senior executives, the identity and background of key shareholders. A pause. "They knew about the intern equity program. They almost certainly knew about the Guardian Clause before tonight, which means the incident with your daughter was not improvised." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "They knew," he said. "We believe so." The working theory is that Tristan's approach to Maya was intentional. Create a visible incident involving you, pivot the narrative to make you look like an aggressive outsider, and use that framing to challenge whatever role the Guardian Clause might play if anyone discovered it. The assumption was that you'd either overreact in a way that discredited you or not react at all, in which case they'd still have the incident to work with. A pause. What they didn't plan for was the precision of your response. The footage shows someone who is in complete control. It's not the footage they needed. Ethan looked at the training center floor. Clean mats, a rack of equipment along the far wall, the morning light coming through the high windows at the angle it came through at 8:50 in the morning. "And Tristan?" he asked. "His family's legal team filed 3 separate motions last night. All of them have been reviewed and denied this morning. Gerald Weiss withdrew from representation at 7 a.m. I'm told that's the first time in 11 years he's withdrawn from a Caldwell matter." A pause that had something in it. Not quite satisfaction, but the specific weight of someone reporting a consequence that was proportionate. The 2 board members submitted resignations before dawn. Preemptive, probably on legal advice. What about the public statements they released? Every outlet that ran them has been contacted by our communications team with the documented timeline showing the statements were pre-drafted. 3 have already issued corrections. The other 3 are in conversation. Marsh paused. "It's not clean. You were right about that last night. The correction never reaches everyone who saw the original. but the record will be clear. Ethan nodded, even though there was no one to see it. Good. There's one more thing. Marsh's voice shifted slightly, still measured, but with something more careful underneath it. Victoria is making a statement at 11 o'clock. Press conference, not a release. She asked me to let you know. Okay. She wrote it herself, didn't go through communications. A pause. I reviewed it. It says what you asked it to say. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He stood in the training center with the phone against his ear, and the morning light coming through the windows, and the smell of clean mats, and he let that information sit for a moment. Thank you, Richard, he said. Don't thank me. I did my job. A brief pause. You did yours. He hung up and stood there for a while. Then he picked up the cleaning cloth and finished wiping down the mats, because they still needed doing. Maya called at 10:15. Did Marsh call you? She asked. She sounded like someone who had slept maybe 4 hours and was running on a combination of coffee and the specific restless energy of someone waiting for things to resolve. This morning. Yeah. The board members resigned. Did he tell you that? He told me. Priya sent me the news alerts. It's a lot. A pause. Dad, they knew. About you, about the clause, about all of it. They planned. She stopped. They used me on purpose. I know. And I keep... He could hear her doing the thing she did when she was working through something that had sharp edges. The pause, the breath, the reorientation. I keep trying to figure out how I feel about that, and it keeps coming out differently every time. That's normal. It doesn't feel normal. It feels like I should have one clear feeling about it. That's not how it works. He was moving toward the small office at the back of the training center, where he had a chair and a window and the remains of his travel mug of coffee. Complicated situations produce complicated feelings. You can be angry about what they did, and also be glad about how it turned out, and also be unsettled about the fact that you were a piece in someone else's game, and none of those things cancel each other out. A pause. When did you get wise? I've always been wise. You just had to get old enough to notice. She laughed. A real one. Tired and genuine. Mom's making a statement at 11. I heard. Are you going to watch it? He thought about it. Probably not live. I have a client at 10:30. Dad? I'll see it afterward. It'll be recorded. A brief silence. She called me last night, after you left. We talked for about 40 minutes. A pause that was different from her earlier pauses. Quieter, more careful. It was... I don't know what it was exactly. It wasn't like when we talk at company events or whatever. It was different. Good different or bad different? Just different, like we were actually talking. She paused. She asked me what I was like in high school, like she genuinely didn't know and wanted to. He didn't say anything. She didn't know I was in the drama club, Maya said. Did you know I did drama club? For 2 years. You played Ophelia in a very spirited production of Hamlet that I attended twice. You came twice? The first time I sat in the wrong seat and couldn't see you well. I moved for the second performance. A silence. She didn't know, Maya said quietly. No, he said. She didn't. I told her, last night. I told her a bunch of stuff about high school and she listened. The whole time, she didn't look at her phone. A pause. I know that's a low bar. It's not nothing, he said. No. A pause. It's not nothing. He could hear something shifting in her voice. Not resolution exactly, but the beginning of something that might become resolution, given time and more 40-minute phone calls, and the slow accumulation of showing up for things. He'd seen this process before, from the other direction. The long, imperfect work of rebuilding something that had been neglected. It didn't happen in a night. It happened in the Tuesday afternoons. I should let you go, she said. 10:30 client. Yeah. Dad? A pause. I meant what I said last night, about thank you. I know you did. And I love you. I love you too, kid. She hung up. He sat in the office chair and finished his coffee, which had gone cold, and looked out the window at the ordinary Tuesday morning street outside. Mad. Victoria's statement ran 11 minutes. He watched it on his phone at 12:45 p.m. between the 10:30 client and his lunch, sitting in the same office chair with the door closed. She stood at a podium in what he recognized as the 42nd floor conference room. Not the boardroom, the one off the main reception hall, smaller, less formal. There was no backdrop with company logos. She was in a dark suit, no jewelry, and she looked like someone who had not slept much and was choosing not to hide that fact. She started with the vote result and the board restructuring, which was the corporate part, and she handled it in about 90 seconds. Clean, factual, the specific efficiency of someone who knew how to move through necessary information without making it take longer than it needed to. Then she stopped and looked directly at the camera. "I want to address something else," she said. "Something that happened last night that this company's initial response did not handle correctly, and that I did not handle correctly, and that I'm going to address now in plain language rather than corporate language, because it deserves that." She talked about Maya. Not by name at first, just a young woman who is an intern at this company, and then, after a beat, my daughter. She described what had happened at the reception in straightforward terms. She said that a shareholder family's representative had made physical contact with a junior employee who was attempting to leave a conversation, and that this was not ambiguous and was not a matter of differing interpretations, and that the security footage confirmed it completely. Then she said, "The first thing I should have done was address her directly and make clear that what happened to her was wrong, and that this company takes it seriously. Instead, I managed the political optics of a board vote. That was my failure, not hers, and I want to say that clearly and on record." She talked about the investigation, the pre-drafted statements, the timeline, the 2 board members whose resignations had been accepted that morning, the ongoing independent review. She said the company would cooperate fully and that the results of the investigation would be made public. And then she said something that he watched twice. "There is one more thing I want to say which is outside the scope of the corporate statement, but which I believe needs to be said. The man who intervened last night, who saw what was happening and did the only appropriate thing without calculation or hesitation, did so because a young woman needed someone to act, and he acted. I want the record to reflect that his response was controlled, proportionate, and correct. The characterization of his actions in certain media reports last night was false, was constructed in advance, and will be addressed through the ongoing investigation." She paused. "He has spent a very long time doing the right thing in rooms where no one was paying attention. Last night people were paying attention. It shouldn't have taken that." She looked at the camera for a moment. "That's the statement," she said. And then she gathered her notes and walked away from the podium, and the recording ended. He sat with his phone in his hand for a while. It wasn't everything. It didn't resolve 17 years into something clean and complete. It didn't give Maya the childhood she'd had the version of rather than the other version, and it didn't give back the years of Tuesday afternoons that had been his alone. It was words at a podium, and words at podiums were a specific kind of thing with a specific kind of weight that was different from action. But it was true. She'd said true things in plain language on record, and that was not nothing, and he was capable of recognizing the difference between nothing and not nothing. He put his phone away and went to make lunch. Ichak. The week that followed was quieter than the night had been, and also, in its own way, more exhausting. The investigation produced documents. The documents produced more documents. 3 attorneys from the outside counsel firm Marsh had engaged, worked through the Caldwell family's communications with the precision of people who had been well compensated to be thorough. And what they found was extensive enough that the story ran for 5 consecutive days across financial news outlets before the appetite for it finally began to thin. Tristan Caldwell made no public statement. His uncle Franklin made one, through a family spokesperson, that acknowledged certain strategic decisions that fell short of our standards in language so carefully constructed it was almost impressive in its emptiness. Gerald Weiss's name appeared in one background piece as a source who declined to comment. The 2 resigned board members retained separate counsel and entered into separate negotiations with the company's legal team that would drag on for 4 months before reaching settlements with non-disclosure provisions that Marsh privately considered inadequate but publicly described as appropriate given the circumstances. None of this was clean. None of it produced the satisfying resolution that the situation seemed, in its dramatic arc, to have earned. Real consequences for real wrongs moved through institutions that were built to move slowly. And justice, when it arrived, arrived partial and procedural and without fanfare. Ethan followed it the way he followed most news, with attention but without investment in outcomes he couldn't control. He'd done what he'd done. The rest of it was the rest of it. What occupied him more, in the weeks after, was the 17-year-old with the scholarship problem. His name was Darius, and he was the kind of kid who showed up to the 6 a.m. Tuesday class in shoes that were held together by more optimism than structural integrity, and who worked harder than anyone else in the room with a specific chip-on-shoulder intensity that Ethan recognized because he'd had it himself at the same age, and it was both an asset and a warning sign depending on how it got directed. Darius had been offered a full scholarship to a university 3 states away that had a very good business program and a very bad fit for who Darius actually was, which was a kid who learned by doing and had no patience for classroom theory, and who had already, at 17, built a small side business fixing electronics out of his mother's garage that netted him more per month than most adults in his neighborhood. The school his parents wanted him to attend was the school you went to when you wanted the thing the scholarship represented: the credential, the social mobility, the narrative of success that could be explained to a grandmother at Thanksgiving. It was not the wrong choice in the abstract. It was just the wrong choice for Darius specifically, which was a harder argument to make to parents who had worked very hard to get their son to the point where the choice was available at all. Ethan had been watching this play out for 3 weeks. He didn't give unsolicited advice. That was a rule he'd established for himself a long time ago, because the people who always had advice were usually the ones who didn't understand that most people already knew what they needed to do and just needed space to arrive at it themselves. But Darius brought it up one morning, 4 days after the Hartwell night, while they were cooling down after class and everyone else had cleared out. "Can I ask you something?" Darius said. He was sitting on the mat, working through a stretch, not looking at Ethan, the body language of someone who had been gathering courage for a question. "Yeah. Did you always know what you wanted to do? Like, when you were my age?" Ethan thought about 17-year-old Ethan, who had wanted to get out of a house that was too small, and a neighborhood that felt like a ceiling, and had looked at the military recruiter's table in his high school cafeteria and felt something that wasn't exactly want, but was the closest thing to a clear direction he'd had access to. "No," he said. "I knew what I needed to do. That's different." Darius looked up. "What's the difference?" "Want is about you. Need is about what the situation requires." He sat down on the mat across from him. "I needed to get somewhere with structure because I wasn't going to do well without it. The military provided structure. What I wanted, that came later, once I had enough ground under me to know what wanting felt like." Darius was quiet for a moment. "What if what you need and what your family needs are different things? Then you have to figure out which need is more important and what you're willing to live with." "That's not..." Darius stopped. "That's not a helpful answer." "No," Ethan agreed. "It isn't." A pause. "The scholarship," Darius said. "I figured. My mom cried when I got it, like actually cried. My dad hasn't talked about anything else for 3 weeks." He was picking at the edge of his shoe, which was giving at the toe seam. "They worked. You don't even know. They worked so hard for us to have options. And this is an option. It's a real option." "It is. But I don't..." He stopped again. "I'm not going to be happy there. I know that. I visited the campus. I sat in on a class. I talked to students. I know what it's going to feel like." "What's it going to feel like?" "Like I'm learning to describe things I should just be doing." He paused. "Does that make sense?" "Yeah," Ethan said. "It does. So what do I do?" Ethan looked at him for a moment, at the shoes held together by optimism, at the 17-year-old with more practical intelligence than most adults he'd met, and a family that loved him, and a decision that didn't have a clean answer. "You tell them the truth," Ethan said, "not a version of it. The actual truth, the way you just told it to me. What the visit felt like, what the class felt like, what you know about how you learn." A pause. "And then you let them be part of the decision, because it's yours to make, but they have a stake in it, and cutting them out of the real conversation isn't respecting that. What if they say, take the scholarship anyway? Then you have more information than you had before, and you make the decision with all of it." "What would you do?" Darius asked. "If it was you?" Ethan thought about it honestly. "I'd take the scholarship," he said, Because at 17, I didn't have enough self-knowledge to trust my own instincts over a guaranteed opportunity. But I'm not you. A pause. You have something at 17 that took me until my late 20s to develop, which is the ability to accurately assess your own nature. That's worth trusting. Darius sat with that. My mom's still going to cry, he said. Probably, Ethan agreed. That's not an argument against the truth. It's just the cost of it. The kid nodded slowly. Then he got up, picked up his bag, and headed for the door. He stopped in the doorway. Were you nervous last night? The thing that's been on the news? Ethan looked at him. A little. You don't seem like someone who gets nervous. Everyone gets nervous. The question is what you do with it. Darius looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded once, the nod of someone filing something away, and he was gone. Ethan sat on the mat in the empty training center and looked at the morning light coming through the windows and thought about self-knowledge, which was the hardest thing to develop and the most useful thing to have, and which you couldn't give someone directly, but could maybe, if you were paying attention and lucky, help them find the conditions for. That was the work. The real work. The work underneath the visible work. It had no certificate. It didn't make headlines. Nobody released a prepared statement about it. He got up, finished his cleaning, and opened the center for the day. 6 weeks after the night at the Hartwell Grand, on a Saturday afternoon in October when the weather had finally committed to being fall, Maya came to the training center. She'd texted ahead, which she didn't always do, coming by around 2 if that's okay, bringing someone. He'd said fine without asking who. The someone turned out to be Victoria. He was wrapping a student's wrist when they came through the door. A middle-aged woman who'd been training with him for 8 months and who was getting genuinely good and who had started coming twice a week, and he finished the wrap and sent her to the bag work while he walked over to meet them. Maya looked good. She had the particular quality of someone who was well-rested, which she hadn't been the last time he'd seen her in person. She'd cut her hair slightly shorter since then. He wasn't sure when, he hadn't noticed it on their video calls. And she was wearing clothes that were clearly off-duty, jeans and a jacket, not her work presentation of herself. Victoria looked like someone who had been doing something difficult for 6 weeks and was partway through it. Not defeated, that wasn't the word. More like someone who had started a long project with no clear end date and had adjusted to the reality of that. She was in clothes that were not CEO clothes, which he'd rarely seen, and she looked younger and also more complicated than she looked on news feeds. Hey, Maya said. Hey. He looked at Victoria. Victoria. Ethan? She nodded. Then looking around the training center with the genuine attention she gave things she was encountering for the first time. This is yours? Lease, but yeah. She was looking at the equipment, the mats, the wall where he'd put up some basic instructional diagrams, the corner where his office was visible through a half-open door. The training center was not impressive in the aesthetic sense. It was functional, practical, lit by fluorescent overheads and 2 high windows, the kind of space that communicated seriousness of purpose rather than prettiness. She was looking at it like she was reading something. I brought her, Maya said to Ethan. She asked if she could come. I wanted you to know that she asked me. Okay, he said. I'm not, Victoria started. I'm not here to negotiate anything or have a conversation about the investigation or any of that. She paused. I wanted to see where you work. Maya talks about it. I wanted to see it. He looked at her for a moment. You want a tour? He said. Something moved in her face. A small surprise, like she'd braced for something else. Sure. It was not a long tour. The center was one main floor with the office and a small equipment storage room. He walked them through it the way he walked everyone through it, matter-of-factly, pointing out the things worth pointing out, not performing modesty about it, but also not overselling it. It was a good training center. It did what it was supposed to do. The people who came here came to work, and the work was real, and that was the whole claim. At the back wall, beside the office door, there was a shadow box, glass-fronted wooden frame, the kind you could buy at any craft store. Inside it, pinned to dark fabric, was a naval special warfare trident. The seal insignia, gold and worn, the wear of something that had been carried through a lot before being retired. Below it, a small index card in his own handwriting. Real strength isn't winning every fight. It's knowing exactly which ones are worth fighting. Maya stopped in front of it. She'd seen it before. She'd been in this building many times. But she stopped and looked at it the way you sometimes looked at familiar things and saw them differently depending on the day you were having. Victoria stopped beside her. They stood there for a moment, the two of them, looking at a piece of metal in a shadow box and a sentence on an index card. "When did you get it?" Victoria asked, quietly. "End of service," Ethan said. 12 years ago. "You put it here instead of somewhere else." "This is where I do the work," he said. "Seemed like the right place for it." She nodded slowly. She was still looking at it. "Maya told me about the Tuesday mornings," she said. "The 6 a.m. class. The kid with the scholarship." "Darius," Maya said. "She said you spent 45 minutes with him last week. He needed to talk through something." "Is he going to take the scholarship?" Ethan shook his head. "He's deferring it. Found a program in the city that's more hands-on. His parents weren't happy for about 2 weeks. They're coming around." A pause. "He made the right call." Victoria was quiet for a moment, then, "How do you know that it was the right call?" "Because he made it for the right reasons, and he can articulate those reasons clearly, and he's not running away from something. He's moving toward something." A pause. "That's usually enough." She turned and looked at him. There was something in her expression that was different from the conference room, different from the lobby at 3 in the morning, different from the podium at 11 o'clock. It was the expression of someone who had put down some part of what she normally carried and was standing without it for a moment, seeing things in the slightly different light that produced. "I've been thinking," she said, "about something you said. In the lobby. About Maya building herself and you being the consistent thing in the room." He waited. "I used to think consistency was, I don't know, the easier choice, the background option. I thought ambition required a kind of motion that consistency couldn't coexist with." She paused. "I'm not sure that's right anymore." "Ambition and consistency aren't opposites," he said. "They just require different things from you." "What does consistency require?" He thought about that honestly. "Deciding what you're for," he said, "and then being that thing even when nobody's watching and it's inconvenient and you're tired and there's no reward coming." A pause. "Most people can do it for a while. The length of time is what differentiates." She held his gaze. "You've been doing it for 12 years, she said. Longer, technically." "I know." A pause. "I'm trying to start." "I know you are," he said. It wasn't a grand exchange. It didn't have the emotional architecture of a confrontation or a reconciliation or any of the dramatic categories that nights like the one at the Hartwell Grand were supposed to produce. It was two people standing in a training center on a Saturday afternoon, talking honestly about something that didn't have clean edges and wasn't going to resolve into something clean. But honest was better than clean. He'd always believed that. Maya had drifted away while they were talking. She was over at the bag, watching the woman he'd been training earlier work through her combinations, saying something that made the woman laugh. She had her mother's ability to enter a room and make people feel seen. She had his stubbornness and his capacity for stillness. She was her own entire person who had built herself from materials that included both of them, but was reducible to neither. That was the thing about raising someone well. You gave them what you had, and you showed up consistently, and you were honest with them even when it was hard, and then you watched them become themselves, which was something you couldn't predict or design. You could only create the conditions for it and then let it happen. He'd done that. In 12 years of Tuesday afternoons and cereal dinners and driving to school and sitting on the floor of whatever room she needed him to sit on the floor of, he'd done that. The rest of it, the night at the Hartwell, the vote, the investigation, the things that would unfold over the months ahead. All of that was what happened when you did the quiet work long enough that it became load-bearing without anyone realizing. The world had looked at Ethan Brooks and seen a man in a $30 shirt at the wrong party, and what it had failed to account for was that the man in the $30 shirt had been doing the most important work in the room for 12 consecutive years. The work just hadn't been visible. That was fine. He'd never needed it to be visible. He drove them to dinner afterward. Maya's suggestion, Victoria's agreement, his truck, which meant Victoria rode in the passenger seat of a 6-year-old Ford F-150 with a dent in the rear panel and a transmission that he was still monitoring, and if she had opinions about this, she kept them to herself. They went to a Thai place 3 blocks from the training center that he went to twice a week, and where the woman who ran the front of house knew his name and brought him water without being asked. It was not an impressive restaurant. The chairs didn't match. The lighting was the overhead kind. The food was very good. Maya ordered for all 3 of them, which she did with the authority of someone who had been here with him before and knew what was worth ordering. Victoria studied the laminated menu with the attention she gave most things, thorough, specific, and then set it down and let Maya handle it. They sat at a table by the window and the food came and they ate it. The conversation was not linear. It moved the way conversations moved when the people having it had a complicated history and were figuring out what shape it was going to take going forward. Around some things, through others, occasionally stopping somewhere unexpected and finding that the ground there was firmer than expected. Victoria asked about the training center, not the tour version, the actual questions, the ones about how he'd built the client base and what the economics looked like and whether the consulting work with private security firms was expanding. She asked like someone who was interested in understanding a thing, not like someone making conversation. He answered in the same register. Maya talked about work, the post-vote restructuring, the investigation's effect on the company culture, the fact that 2 of the interns in her cohort had been approached by headhunters from other firms and were weighing their options. She had opinions about all of it, clear ones, and she stated them without hedging, and Victoria listened with the specific attention of a CEO and also the specific attention of a parent, hearing their child think out loud. And those were different kinds of listening, and she was doing both. At one point, Maya said, "The woman this morning, the one you were training, how long has she been coming?" 8 months. What's her story? She works nights at a hospital. She started coming because her stress levels were affecting her sleep. Now she comes because she's genuinely good at it, and she likes being good at something on her own terms. Maya nodded. Do all your regulars have stories like that? Everyone has a story like that, he said. That's what brings people to a gym at 6 in the morning. It's never really about fitness. Victoria looked at him. What's it about? He thought about it. Control, he said. In a life that mostly doesn't offer it, you can't control most things. You can control whether you show up and do the work. A pause. That's enough for most people. It's enough for me. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked out the window at the street, the ordinary Saturday afternoon street, and he could see her processing something without performing the processing. They finished dinner. Maya paid before either of them could, with the specific preemptive efficiency of a person who had planned that move in advance, and when both of them protested, she said, I have a salary now. Let me use it. So they let her. Outside on the sidewalk, in the October afternoon light that had gone the warm amber color of late fall, they stood for a moment in the particular way of people who have been through something together and are standing at the end of a day that was better than they'd had reason to expect. Maya hugged him. Long, both arms, the way she had at the beginning of the Hartwell night. He hugged her back. Call me tomorrow, she said into his shoulder. You call me, he said. You're better at remembering. That's true. She pulled back, looked at him. I love you. Love you too. She turned to her mother. They stood for a moment, and then Victoria opened her arms, and Maya stepped into them, and the hug was not long and not smooth and had the slightly awkward quality of 2 people who were learning how to do this again after a long time of not doing it, which was exactly what it was. When it was over, Maya said, Same time next month? Victoria looked at her. Something crossed her face, the emotion she usually managed, briefly unmanaged. Yeah, she said. Same time. Maya smiled. Then she turned and walked toward her car, 2 blocks down, and they watched her go. He and Victoria stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Thank you, she said. For dinner. For letting us come to the center. You can come back, he said. You don't need an occasion. She nodded. A pause. I'm going to mess this up sometimes, she said. The trying. I'm going to default to what I default to. And there are going to be times when the company comes first and she knows it. Yeah, he said. Probably. I'm telling you because... She stopped. I don't know why I'm telling you. Because you're used to managing expectations, he said. So you're managing mine. She almost smiled. Is it working? My expectations for you aren't low, he said. They never were. That was never the problem. She looked at him for a moment. What was the problem? She asked. He thought about that honestly, the way he tried to think about most things. You built something real, he said, and it mattered to you in a way that made it hard to build other things at the same time. That's not a moral failing, it's a choice with costs. He paused. The costs landed mostly on Maya. She carried them without complaining and built herself anyway. That's not a reason to stop trying now. Another pause. She wants you in her life. She's made that clear in about 16 different ways in the last 6 weeks. Don't overthink it. Just show up. Victoria looked at the sidewalk, then at him. You make it sound simple, she said. It is simple, he said. It's just not easy. Those are different things. She nodded slowly. Then she reached out and put her hand on his forearm for a moment. Brief, not heavy. The touch of someone who had something to say and didn't have words for it. Then she withdrew it, said goodnight, and walked to her car. He stood on the sidewalk and watched her go, and then he stood there for a moment after she was gone, in the amber October light, with the ordinary street around him. He didn't feel resolved exactly. Resolution was a kind of closing, and what this felt like was the opposite. Not an ending, but a beginning of something that didn't have a clear shape yet, and would probably never have a perfectly clean one, because clean shapes were for things that didn't involve actual people with actual histories and actual imperfections. He was okay with that. He'd always been okay with the absence of clean shapes. He walked back to the training center because he'd left the lights on and needed to lock up. And because there was always something to do, and because the work was never actually finished, it just rested for a while between the days you showed up to do it. The trident was still in the shadow box when he came back in. The index card was still below it. He stood in front of it for a moment before he turned the lights off, which was not a thing he usually did. He locked up by habit and routine, not ceremony. But he stood there for a moment and looked at it. 12 years ago, he'd made a choice in a room very different from this one, and the choice had cost him things he'd known it would cost, and had given him things he hadn't fully understood it would give, and the sum of those two columns was a life that he could stand inside without flinching. That was not nothing. That was not a small thing. He turned off the lights and locked the door and walked to his truck in the October dusk. And the transmission turned over without complaint, and he drove home through the ordinary streets of an ordinary Saturday evening, and somewhere across the city, his daughter was in her apartment probably calling Priya, and somewhere across the city, a woman who had built something real was figuring out how to build something else alongside it, and somewhere a 17-year-old kid was having a conversation with his parents that was hard and necessary and true. All of it was in motion, all of it imperfect and unresolved and ongoing. He drove home. He made dinner, real dinner, not eggs. He'd bought groceries Tuesday. And he ate it at the kitchen table with the window open because the October air was good. And he went to bed at a reasonable hour, and his alarm was set for 5:40. And there was a class tomorrow morning with 12 people who were going to show up because they'd decided to show up. And that was enough. It had always been enough. The strongest man in the room was never the one who needed the room to know he was there. He was the one who showed up anyway.